Sorry about the echo. Today we'll be talking all about gopher tortoises. I'll be teaching you about gopher tortoise habitat, the status of the gopher tortoise, our permitting program, law enforcement, regulations, how FWC can help local governments and how local governments can help the FWC with gopher tortoise conservation, some incentive programs that are offered by the Gopher Tortoise Conservation Program at FWC, as well as some of the incentive programs offered by the federal government as well. So with that, after my talk, Heather Hitt will be giving a presentation on Florida's Wildlife Legacy Initiative, and then Tim Towles will be giving a short presentation on the Landowner Assistance Program at FWC. After that, we will have a question and answer session, followed by a burrow and habitat tour led by Michelle Stromberg from the city of Sebastian, who is also hosting us here today, so thank you very much for that. So, to begin the presentation, the gopher tortoise is one of 4 tortoise species found in North America. 4 main tortoise species. There are subspecies of the other tortoises. It is the only tortoise that is found east of the Mississippi River. So in the state of Florida, if you find a tortoise, it is likely a gopher tortoise. There are other tortoises found in Florida, but they are not native species. The most common one found is the sulcata, or African spur-thighed tortoise. They do look a little bit like gopher tortoises when they're young, when they're juveniles, but they get to be about 200 pounds and about this large. They're a lot bigger. They have really big spurs on their front limbs, and they have kind of a lighter coloration. So gopher tortoises like to live anywhere that has well-drained sandy soils. So there's a wide variety of habitats you can see here. Gopher tortoises will live in sandhills, eric hammock, mesic flatwoods, scrubs, scrubby flatwoods, coastal dune ecosystems, as well as pasture lands, improved pastures, disturbed areas, people's backyards, anywhere basically that it doesn't flood. So to identify a gopher tortoise, they do have some distinguishing characteristics. They have these stumpy back legs that you can see. We call those elephantine rear limbs. They have a pointy claw on the tip of each of those rear limbs. They use those short little feet to brace themselves while they're digging their burrows. The little claw kind of digs into the ground and their feet support their weight while they're digging forward. Their front limbs are very, very powerful, so if they didn't have the supportive rear limbs, they would move all over the place while trying to dig a burrow. The front limbs look like a garden spade. They're big, powerful, kind of flat, shovel-like front limbs. They have a long set of claws on the front of each foot. We say they have shovel-like front feet, as opposed to a turtle that would have curved claws and webbed feet, or other tortoises that sometimes have curved claws as well. The gopher tortoises are primarily straight. Also, they have a broad head with a non-projecting snout. So adult gopher tortoises can be anywhere from a gray to tan or brown coloration, as you see in the photos above. They're about the size of a large dinner plate when they're full grown. They can be up to 30 pounds. So as opposed to the sulcata or African spur-thighed tortoise I mentioned, those get up to 200 pounds. That's a large difference in size. The female gopher tortoise will lay her eggs in the apron of a gopher tortoise burrow, which is the area of loose soil in front of the burrow. She'll lightly cover them with sand, and then the eggs will hatch. So when the eggs hatch, they're about the size of a ping pong ball, so they're very, very small. Imagine a tortoise fitting inside of a ping pong ball. The hatchlings are extremely small. They have a little egg tooth on the tip of their snout that they use to break free from the shell. That falls off about 2 weeks after they hatch. And then they look like the little hatchlings you see in the middle photo above. So when they're that small, you can see there's 2 in the palm of this person's hand. They're very, very vulnerable to predators. They have a yellow coloration in the center of each plate on the back of their carapace, which is the top of their shell. The yellow signifies growth. Their shell doesn't harden until they're about 7 years old. So the first 7 years of their life, they're susceptible to a wide variety of predators, anything from fire ants to raccoons, possums, skunks, coyotes, foxes. Basically, everything wants to eat them. We call them nature's ravioli because they look like little raviolis and everything wants to eat them. So those plates on the back of the carapace are called scutes, and they will start to turn that gray or brown coloration as the shell hardens and as the tortoise gets older. If you look at the below right picture, you can see that that hatchling tortoise has a small gopher tortoise burrow. They will dig their own burrows, starting from right when they hatch out of the eggshell. Sometimes they will take over adult gopher tortoise burrows or maintain burrows that have been abandoned. They will dig into those and use those kind of as a starter burrow for themselves. But still, they don't like to share burrows, so there's usually only one tortoise per burrow. That goes the same for adults as well. So this is the distribution of gopher tortoises throughout the southeastern United States. They are found everywhere from the very southern portion of South Carolina all the way through Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. In the state of Florida, they're found in all 67 counties. So every single county in Florida has gopher tortoises. The only areas in Florida you won't find gopher tortoises are in the wettest portions of the Everglades where they can't dig burrows, in the Lake Okeechobee, which obviously they don't swim, they're tortoises, and also in the Okefenokee Swamp area. So everywhere else in Florida, you will find gopher tortoises. Their populations are larger in some areas as compared to others, but they are found everywhere. In Florida, they're state listed as a threatened species, so they're not federally listed in Florida, but they are a candidate species for federal listing, but they've been precluded by other species. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service uses a series of criteria to assess whether a species warrants listings to be listed, and basically there were other species that were a higher priority in comparison to the gopher tortoise. They haven't been listed federally yet. If you look at this blue area, which is west of the Mobile and Tombigbee River in Alabama, so that portion of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, they are federally listed as threatened by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In the other portion of Alabama, the gray portion you see, they are a non-game species, so they are not a listed species in that portion of Alabama. And then in Georgia, they are a state-listed threatened species as well. And in that very small portion of South Carolina, they are state-listed as endangered. The population there has been decimated, and they are now trying to restock populations in two particular areas. And we actually have a memorandum of agreement with the state of South Carolina where we take a certain type of tortoise, which I'll talk about later, called waif tortoises, and we relocate them to South Carolina to restock their lands. We've moved about just under 200 tortoises there. They're all doing fantastic. So why are populations declining? What's the number one reason for the need for listing of the gopher tortoise? The number one reason is habitat loss. So gopher tortoises like to dig their burrows, and they like to live in habitats that human beings also like to live in, areas that have nice, well-drained sandy soils where there's no flooding. That's where people like to develop. That's where they like to build their homes. So if you look at these two maps here, you can see on the left, that's the current land use in Florida. All of the orange signifies areas of development. If you look at the projected land use for 2060 on the right, you can see how much more development there is. Especially in southwest Florida and northeast Florida, the portions around Jacksonville, as well as basically from Tampa down to Naples. That whole area is going to expand and grow, and that is all prime gopher tortoise habitat. So that is the number one reason for loss. The number one reason for decline is habitat loss. Also habitat fragmentation, so when people build roads through habitat or utilities or any linear construction that separates pieces of habitat, that is also an important factor. Habitat degradation, so fire suppression. Florida ecosystems, the majority of them naturally burn. Burning is a good thing. It's the way that ecosystems naturally occurred in Florida for millennia. So sometimes these habitats are close to schools or interstates or areas where it's dangerous to human beings to burn. So they suppress the fire, they don't allow burning to take place, and that doesn't allow the gopher tortoise to live in that habitat based on their requirements. Disease is another factor, so gopher tortoises are susceptible to a disease called upper respiratory tract disease, or URTD for short. That disease affects the upper respiratory tract. It causes them to have an ocular and nasal discharge, reddening of the eyes. It makes them act very strange. They bask at night instead of the daytime. They might not forage. They might not come out of their burrow. They might not try to avoid predators. They just act very, very strangely, and it is an issue with gopher tortoises. Also, illegal harvest. People do eat gopher tortoises. It's not as prominent as it used to be, but it is still an issue. So that is another reason for decline. And finally, road mortality. So gopher tortoises do get hit by cars quite frequently. They like to cross major roadways. They get hit by cars, and that is another problem. So the gopher tortoise is particularly prone to decline because they have such a long lifespan. They live 40 to 60 years in the wild. In captivity, they can live even longer. They can live up to their 90s. I believe there's one that's 93 in Canada, and that's the record longest living gopher tortoise. So they don't live as long as the Galapagos tortoises or the Aldabra tortoises, which can live hundreds of years, but they're still a very long-lived species. They're slow to reproductive maturity, so a female will take anywhere from 9 to 21 years to reach reproductive maturity. The range, such a large range between 9 and 21 years, is specifically due to where they live within their range. So if they live in an area that has very cold, harsh winters, they'll spend the majority of their time in their burrow during that time because they can't be out in sub-zero temperatures, and they won't get to forage as much. It'll take them longer, more growth cycles to reach that reproductive maturity. In an area like South Florida, they'd be closer to 9 years because they can forage year-round. Females also have a low reproductive rate. So a female lays at most 1 clutch of eggs per year. There's about 5 to 9 eggs in that clutch. The record, I believe, reported of eggs being laid was 25, but that's a very rare circumstance. Most of the time it's about 5 to 9 eggs. About 94 to 96% of those eggs won't make it into adulthood, so they have a very high predation rate. And sometimes a female might not even lay a clutch of eggs for the same reason I mentioned before. If they have a harsh winter and they can't forage enough, they won't have the energy to reproduce, or they might not have the energy to find a mate. So this slide shows a little bit of the history of the legal status of gopher tortoises. So they were listed as threatened in 1975. In 1978, they were downlisted to a species of special concern. Harvest has been prohibited since 1988, and they were relisted as a threatened species in 2007. That is also when the Gopher Tortoise Management Plan was created. So just for a little background on how this listing goes, basically it's assessed by 3 generations of tortoises, or 3 generations of whatever species is being listed. So over 3 generations, if there is 50% or more decline and loss, they are considered a threatened species. If it's 80% or more, they are considered a endangered species. And I believe if it's 30% or more, 30% to 50%, they're a species of special concern. So because the gopher tortoise has a generation of 31 years, because it's such a long-lived species, the period of time assessed to see if there has been 50% loss is 93 years. So although there still are hundreds of thousands of gopher tortoises in Florida, they are considered a threatened species because over 93 years, they have lost 50% of their population. So I mentioned the Gopher Tortoise Management Plan. That is the plan that manages the species for the state of Florida. It was put together through 10 years of intensive work from FWC commissioners, FWC staff, as well as stakeholders. So this Gopher Tortoise Technical Assistance Group is a group that was formed in 2005 that helped write the management plan. The Gopher Tortoise Technical Assistance Group, or GT-TAG, meets quarterly, so 4 times a year. It's comprised of 30 individuals, 3 different members, for representing 10 different interest groups. So some of those interest groups include local governments, primary industries, agriculture, silviculture, forestry, also some non-governmental interests, and animal advocacy groups. So if you're interested in receiving notifications from the GT-TAG group, you can go to our website, click this Sign Up tab at the top of the website. It'll ask you to create an account, so you enter your email address and password, and then actually not just for GT-TAG, but for any FWC notifications, you can choose which ones you'd like to receive. If you go to Gopher Tortoises, GT-TAG is one of those groups you can receive notifications from. They also frequently have open spots on the local government group within GT-TAG, as well as some other areas, so if you're interested in joining, you can always look for notifications on that. So the Gopher Tortoise Management Plan has a goal to restore and maintain secure, viable populations throughout Florida so the species no longer warrants listing. The 4 main objectives of the Gopher Tortoise Management Plan to meet that goal are to minimize the loss of gopher tortoises, to increase and improve habitat, to restore populations where they've been depleted, and to maintain the gopher tortoise's role as a keystone species. We do have a slew of conservation actions and strategies to meet those objectives and ultimately reach our goal. Regulation, permitting, and law enforcement are some of those, and here are all of them. We will go through each one of these, so highlighted in green is regulations. We'll begin with that. Also, when we get to permitting, when we get past permitting, that's about halfway through this presentation, so we can take a short break. It's a lot of information in a short amount of time, and then we'll continue with the rest. So the first 3 sections are basically half of the presentation. So Florida Administrative Code Rule 688.27.001 is the rule that defines what a take is. So I'm not going to read all of this. You can read it for yourself if you'd like. But in short, a take is anything that alters the natural behavior of a species. So that's basically what all this says right here. 68A27.003 specifically pertains to gopher tortoises, and it states that no person shall take or attempt to take, pursue, hunt, harass, capture, possess, sell, or transport any gopher tortoise, any parts thereof, their eggs, or molest, damage, or destroy gopher tortoise burrows. So not only is the gopher tortoise protected, all parts of gopher tortoises are protected, including a shell you would find on the ground. Their eggs are protected, and the burrow is protected in the state of Florida. What's unique about this rule in the state of Florida as compared to some other states is that not only does it explain what is protected, it gives a description of the gopher tortoise burrow. So it states that the burrow is protected, as well as says that a gopher tortoise burrow is a tunnel with a cross-section that closely approximates the shape of a gopher tortoise. So that description allows people reading the rule to know basically what a gopher tortoise burrow looks like. So why are the burrows protected? Why are they so important? The reason why is because the gopher tortoise is a keystone species. So for those that are unfamiliar with the term keystone species, it comes from the keystone in the arch. So if you look at the top of this arch, you can see the keystone is the center stone that not only holds and supports the weight of the arch itself, but also all of the stones on top of the arch and all of the weight on top of the arch. So the gopher tortoise acts like this keystone in the ecosystem, whereas if you pulled that stone out, the entire arch and structure would collapse. The gopher tortoises act that way in the ecosystem, basically because their burrows provide refuge for 362 species of wildlife, and a lot of those species are also listed species. So without the gopher tortoise burrow, many of these species would not be able to exist, and the ones that would be able to exist without the burrow would be in much lower numbers. So about 300 of those 362 species are invertebrates, so different scarab beetles and mites and ticks and moths and things of that nature. And the other 62 or so are vertebrates, so rattlesnakes, indigo snakes, pine snakes, different mice species. We've got 6-line race runners. The list goes on and on and on. It's a lot of animals. And they use the burrow to escape extreme extreme temperatures, so really hot temperatures in the summertime, really cold temperatures in the wintertime. Also fire. I mentioned before that Florida has a natural fire regime where most of these ecosystems burn naturally, and also now through prescribed fire. So they used the burrow to escape fires, also dehydration when you have really hot temperatures, as well as depredation. So they use the burrows to avoid predators. So many of the species are federally listed, are state or federally listed. Some of the state listed species you can see in this slide. You have the Florida pine snake, the Florida mouse, and the gopher frog. So one of the federally listed species that's frequently found in gopher tortoise burrows is the eastern indigo snake. So there are a lot of important species found in burrows as well. We do have conservation actions for commensal species in the Gopher Tortoise Management Plan. Those are mutually beneficial for both the commensal species as well as the gopher tortoise. So the term commensal species refers to all the species that live inside the burrow and require it. Basically, the term comes from commensalism, which means that the species benefit from living in the gopher tortoise burrow, but the gopher tortoise is neither harmed or benefited. There are some species that also benefit the gopher tortoise, and they're more of the obligate species, such as gopher, there's obligate species, and then there's the ones that the gopher tortoise relies on, like dung beetles that clean up after the gopher tortoise, and some other species. And then there's obligate species that are only found inside gopher tortoise burrows. Usually they have the name Gophurus in their scientific name. So the gopher tick, there's like 6 different species of scarab beetle that are only found in gopher tortoise burrows, so they wouldn't exist without the gopher tortoise. They've fulfilled that role. We do have an interim policy on the relocation of listed and non-listed commensals. Right now, that policy for the most part is to release them on site. If you're excavating a burrow or trapping gopher tortoises and you find a commensal species, you release them on site. There are certain circumstances where habitat may need to be created for them, but that will likely change very shortly with the Imperiled Species Management Plan. So unlike the gopher tortoise that has its own program and own management plan, and bears that have their own management plan at FWC, the Imperiled Species Management Plan is basically a comprehensive management plan for a whole group of different listed species in Florida. Right now there are 57 species listed in the plan. It originally started with 64 in 2010. There were 3 federally listed species included at that time. Now it is 57 species. The latest draft of the plan was released on July 18th of this year. Right now it is undergoing a 45-day public comment period, so if anybody wants to read the plan and comment on it, feel free to do so. Also, final approval is expected in November of this year. It does include gopher tortoise commensal species, and basically what's happened is a lot of species that were previously species of special concern have been upgraded to threatened species. Some threatened species downgraded to species of special concern, and about 15 different species have been removed from listing, which includes the gopher frog. It was a species of special concern and will now not be a listed species anymore under this plan, but it will still be included in the plan for monitoring purposes to ensure that the population does not decline. So, I'm not an expert on this plan, but if anybody would like to know more, you can contact Claire Sundquist with FWC or email imperiled@myfwc.com, or you can go to the website to learn more about the plan itself. And just to answer your questions before you ask them, that is not a mouse being impaled. So that is a mouse being weighed. I have gotten that question a lot. So this mouse is being weighed, he's perfectly happy, and he's just holding on for dear life for another reason. So now we'll discuss how to identify gopher tortoise burrows in their natural setting. So the Gopher Tortoise Conservation Program has 2 main classifications for gopher tortoise burrow identification. One is potentially occupied, which has 2 subclassifications of active and inactive. The other is abandoned. So a potentially occupied burrow that is active will be in good repair. You'll see that it looks like a freshly maintained burrow. It will have a half-moon shaped opening, half-moon shaped entrance. You can see here that this burrow entry looks in the same way as the profile of a gopher tortoise. So gopher tortoises fit very snugly inside their burrow. So any burrow that you find, the width of that burrow is going to represent the width of the gopher tortoise that lives inside of it. Also, there might be tortoise tracks. If you look up in this photo, it's kind of hard to see on the overhead here, but on the screens you can notice it. There is a slide mark, a belly slide mark in the center there going into the burrow. So as gopher tortoises go in, they'll slide their plastron on the ground and you'll see that slide mark. Also, the soil in front, which is called the apron, is going to be loose, not hard packed. Freshly dug soil from maintaining or digging the burrow is thrown out in front of it, and that's what the apron is. Also, it's clear of vegetation because the tortoise has recently come in and out of the burrow. As opposed to a potentially occupied active burrow, a potentially occupied inactive burrow will still have the half-moon shape, so that's the most important thing. If the burrow has a half-moon shape, it is considered potentially occupied and it is protected by state law. So this burrow, even though it looks like it hasn't been used in a while, it's still protected by state law. If it's got that half-moon shape, it is protected. The soil in front, the apron, might be hard-packed. There might not be any tracks. The burrow might have vegetation growing in front of it or around it. There may be, in this case, there's pine needles all stuffed into the burrow. But this burrow is still protected by state law. And the reason why is because gopher tortoises that live in areas that have decently cold winters will spend up to a month inside their burrow, sometimes longer. So if the gopher tortoise is in its burrow for a month, it's not maintaining the mouth of the burrow. So the mouth of the burrow may look like this, but inside the burrow there may still be a gopher tortoise. So as long as that half-moon shape is there, it means that it's been maintained sometime recently. So although there may not be a gopher tortoise in this burrow, there's a good chance that there is. So because of that, it is still protected by state law. So any potentially occupied burrow is protected by the laws of the state of Florida. As opposed to potentially occupied, this is an abandoned burrow. So an abandoned burrow appears unused, it's dilapidated, the entrance is either partially or completely collapsed. The burrow may be partially or completely filled with leaves or soil. So this burrow actually looks like it was taken over by an armadillo. That half-moon shape was rounded out. Armadillos tend to dig round burrows as opposed to, some people like to call them hamburger bun-shaped burrows. A good way to remember what a gopher tortoise burrow looks like. But this burrow is not protected anymore. So once a burrow is abandoned, the state of Florida, the laws of the state of Florida no longer apply. So any impact to potentially occupied burrows requires an FWC permit. An impact to an abandoned burrow does not require an FWC permit. So now we'll discuss a little about law enforcement. So the Gopher Tortoise Conservation Program does train law enforcement recruits at the Law Enforcement Training Academy in Midway. We've been doing that for a few years now. We developed a training manual for recruits in 2010. It's a very large, very detailed training manual. It's got everything about the Gopher Tortoise permitting guidelines and our management plan in it, how to spot Gopher Tortoise violations, things of that nature. A few semesters ago, one of my interns, Brian Hutchinson, who's now an employee for FWC, he created this FWC Law Enforcement Field Guide, which is kind of a short version of that manual. It's really great. It's short and to the point. It's got a nice flow chart on it, so if an officer is in the field and assessing potential Gopher Tortoise violation, they can follow the flow chart and see, okay, is this an exempt activity? Is this an activity that requires a permit? If it is, what violation has occurred? What's the law specifically or the rule specifically that they violated? So it's really great. It helps law enforcement in the field, and we are disseminating that to law enforcement around the state of Florida. It was implemented in May of 2016. We also train existing field personnel. We have law enforcement training classes, and we've increased communication between biologists and FWC law enforcement staff. We do have a law enforcement liaison, Avery Tubbs, Captain Avery Tubbs. He either calls in or sits in at all of our monthly Gopher Tortoise Conservation Program meetings that we hold, and any law enforcement issues we're having or some problems that we think we can make easier on law enforcement in the field, we tend to discuss, and then he disseminates that information to the regional captains. So here are some examples of Gopher Tortoise rule violations. So the first one is pretty obvious: killing or causing direct harm to Gopher tortoises. That is a big no-no. That is against the law in the state of Florida. You cannot kill a Gopher tortoise. In fact, killing a Gopher tortoise could result in being charged with a third-degree felony. Any other action that impacts a Gopher tortoise could be charged, you could be charged with a second-degree misdemeanor. So collapsing, blocking, covering, or filling in Gopher tortoise burrows without a permit is also against the law. You need a permit to impact a burrow. Also, placing harmful substances or devices inside Gopher tortoise burrows. So there used to be these rattlesnake roundups all over Florida. They still have them in some other states. Actually, I think there's 2 left, and they're both in Alabama. But people used to gas Gopher tortoise burrows and kill everything inside, including the Gopher tortoise burrows, in hopes of killing rattlesnakes for these roundups, or getting the rattlesnakes to come out of the burrow. That's no longer allowed in Florida. There is a Florida Administrative Code rule that prevents you from gassing a burrow, or putting anything in the burrow for that matter. So that's a good thing. Also, significantly modifying or degrading habitat if it kills or injures wildlife or creates the likelihood of injury by disrupting normal feeding behaviors. So these are all examples of rule violations for Gopher tortoises. So how can you determine if a violation has occurred? If there's evidence of remnant burrows on a site, so you see variations in soil coloration from the burrow apron, that area where they've been maintaining their burrow and throwing out fresh sand. If you see the apron but you don't see a burrow, it's likely that someone collapsed that burrow, but the apron is still visible. Also, depressions in the soil from a collapsed burrow, that's another sign of a violation. A hole or opening where a tortoise has dug out of a collapsed burrow. So, Gopher tortoises are master excavators. They can dig out of collapsed burrows. Most people think that if a burrow is collapsed, the Gopher tortoise, it automatically will die a slow, horrible death and never be able to get out of its burrow. That's not always the case. The majority of the time they can dig out. The only times that they'll be stuck in their burrow and entombed in there is if someone either paves over the burrow or puts some type of structure over the burrow, or if they place sod down on top of the burrow or some type of landscaping. So if there's thick roots or grass, they won't be able to dig through that, or if obviously there's a hard structure on top of the burrow. But in most other cases, not all other cases, but most, they'll be able to dig out. They also can live for a long time in the burrow if it's been collapsed, so they have plenty of time to try to dig out. So if you find a hole or an opening in the ground as you're walking a property, it's likely that's where a tortoise dug out. So if the adjacent property has Gopher tortoise burrows, so let's say you have this area that's all the same habitat, it's all different lots. All the other lots have gopher tortoises on them, but they're claiming this one lot in the middle of all the other ones does not have gopher tortoises on it. They didn't get a permit, they developed and cleared the lot. Chances are that lot had gopher tortoises on it. It's pretty impossible that it would not, unless for some reason it was, the water table was much higher or there was some other characteristic that would have influenced that one area. Gopher tortoises are on the property. If you see gopher tortoises on the property but no burrows, chances are those burrows were collapsed. The gopher tortoises are coming back trying to find their burrows. So this right here is an example of what we call a crop circle. Basically, a developer tried to avoid the need for a permit by avoiding a gopher tortoise burrow of a radius of 25 feet. Our permitting guidelines state that any impact to a burrow within 25 feet requires an FWC permit. So this developer has avoided that burrow within 25 feet. This is actually a take. This is not allowed. The reason why it is a take is specifically due to that 68A 27.001 definition of a take. It harasses wildlife by significantly disrupting normal feeding behavior. So the gopher tortoise used to have access to all this forage. Now it's got 25 feet around its burrow and nothing else. So the rest of the property was moonscaped. The gopher tortoise doesn't have the same ability to feed anymore. This is a take. So if you ever see this, you know that that is not allowed. And if you're a developer, I wouldn't recommend that. So here is a pie chart showing gopher tortoise complaints by region from January of 2013 to 2016. You can see that the areas that have the most complaints are also the areas that have the highest rate of development, which are the southwest and the northeast. The northeast has the largest at 40%, or 843 complaints. I believe, let's see, okay, so the third region, or the third highest region is the north central region, which is around Lake City, and I think this is technically FWC region. Is this the south region? Northeast? Okay. So this is part of that 843 call region. So this is part of the region that gets the most gopher tortoise complaints. Now, even though this slide is titled Gopher Tortoise Complaints by Region, it's not necessarily always complaints. It may be someone just calling saying that they have a gopher tortoise in their yard and they don't know what it is or what to do with it. People who are newly moved to Florida don't know what this animal is and they find it in their backyard and they're afraid of it. Some people think that they're aggressive for some reason, which they're definitely not. A gopher tortoise will never attack you. But these are all calls that come into our wildlife alert hotline. So now we've made it to the permitting section. Since June of 2007, FWC requires that all gopher tortoises must be relocated out of harm's way prior to any land clearing or development. Any property owners that are developing must obtain permits from FWC before tortoises are moved. So our gopher tortoise permitting guidelines that explain everything basically in our permitting program were approved in April of 2008. They were last revised in February of 2015, and it provides authorization to impact gopher tortoise and their burrows through various permits. The permits are conditioned so that activities must be conducted in accordance with the Florida Administrative Code rules and FWC guidelines. So there are some activities that are exempt from our permitting program. Routine agricultural practices, silvicultural activities or tree farming, also wildlife management activities, linear utility and highway right-of-way vegetation maintenance, and routine yard maintenance. So you don't need a gopher tortoise permit, a relocation permit to mow your yard if you have burrows in it, just in case anyone was wondering. So although these activities are exempt from our gopher tortoise permitting program, it does not mean that because your land is zoned for agriculture, you can just walk around and collapse all the burrows on your land. It means that if you're specifically conducting a bona fide agricultural practice, so planting row crops or plowing a field or something of that nature, and there is a burrow in your way, you don't need to obtain a permit to impact that burrow. Doesn't mean you can go, building a house on that agricultural land or a barn or something like that and destroy all the burrows to build that barn. Or in one case recently, there was a chicken farm built in North Florida where they said, oh, these are agricultural practices, so we don't need a permit. Well, they were building a structure, they were moving soil, it was a construction project, not an agricultural practice, so that was a violation. Let's see. We also have this wonderful best management practices fact sheet that you can find on the back table. This explains how to minimize impacts to gopher tortoise burrows when you are impacting or when you are conducting one of these exempt activities. Now, these best management practices are specific to gopher tortoises, but they came from a Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services best management practices for wildlife list, both for agriculture and silviculture. And this is kind of the short version of that specifically for gopher tortoises. But the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services manual is specific to a lot of other species as well. So if you'd like to go and look at this, some examples would be if you're conducting highway right-of-way maintenance or road right-of-way maintenance to mow at times of the day where gopher tortoises are less likely to be out. So in the summertime, that's going to be at the cooler times of the day. In the wintertime, that's going to be at the hotter times of the day, depending on where you are in latitude. So please feel free to take a look at that. So what activities do require a permit? Basically, every activity that isn't listed as an exempt activity in the previous slide. So a permit is required for any activity, including clearing, grading, paving, bulldozing, digging, construction, or site preparation. So any soil disturbance requires an FWC relocation permit before soil disturbance or before any activities take place on that lot. So all gopher tortoises within 25 feet of construction, development, or soil disturbance must be relocated. Prior to site disturbance, permits must be obtained from FWC, and gopher tortoises must be captured and relocated. A copy of the permit must also be posted on site, and if you're an authorized agent authorized to conduct some of these activities, you also have to have your authorized agent permit on you at all times. So speaking of authorized agents, here you can see a slew of different permits that we offer. We have a wide variety of permits to meet the needs of so many different types of permittees. So many different people require different types of permits and had different needs. We're trying to make this as easy as possible on them, so we offer all different permits for different situations. The first one that I'm going to discuss is the authorized gopher tortoise agent permit, and then I'll go through all of the ones that are highlighted in green. The ones in black we also offer, and if anybody has any questions on those, you can ask me personally or in the question and answer session that'll take place after presentations, but they're less common than the ones highlighted. So an authorized gopher tortoise agent is required when relocating gopher tortoises off-site or when excavating gopher tortoise burrows using heavy equipment. Authorized agents are permitted to perform tasks based on their training and experience. So there are authorized gopher tortoise agent training courses that you can take. Two private companies offer those. Or if you have previous experience by working with an authorized agent, as someone in a consulting firm or something of that nature, you're working under an agent and you gain experience in bucket trapping or some other activity, you can be permitted as an authorized agent to conduct those specific activities. So the relocation activities that do require this authorized agent gopher tortoise permit are bucket trapping, live trapping, and hand shovel excavation, transport, marking, and release of tortoises, collection of blood samples, and the supervision of burrow excavation using a backhoe. So for example, if you had no experience supervising the use of a backhoe to excavate a burrow, you applied for an authorized agent permit, you would not be permitted through your authorized agent permit to do that activity. Let's say you only had bucket trapping experience, that's what you would be permitted to do. If you had multiple experience in multiple things, then you would be permitted for those specific activities. We also offer this 10 or fewer burrows permit. So this permit was originally created for single-family homeowners. That's the original intent of the permit. It's not always used in that circumstance, but it is most frequently used in that circumstance. This is for projects with no more than 10 burrows impacted. So at FWC, at the Gopher Tortoise program, we say for the purposes of our permits that for every 2 burrows, there's 1 gopher tortoise, because gopher tortoises do have multiple burrows. Sometimes they'll have 3 or 4 burrows, but on average, it's about 2 burrows per tortoise. So a 10 or fewer burrows permit would be for 5 tortoises or less. It allows on-site relocation. Not all permits allow for on-site relocation. So basically, if there's sufficient habitat remaining after the project is complete, you can relocate the tortoises on site. The other thing that's important about it is that it doesn't require the use of an authorized agent as long as you're not using a backhoe to excavate those burrows and as long as you're releasing on site. So some single-family homeowners, they might want to build a pool in their backyard and there's a couple burrows in that area. They can go online and take our e-learning and pass the quiz. It tells you how to bucket trap the tortoises or how to hand shovel excavate the burrows, which is fairly difficult if you can't trap them. What they would do is they would complete the e-learning, take the quiz, pass that information to us, their certificate that they've completed the quiz. They would be issued a permit to bucket trap those tortoises. Then, after they trap the tortoise, what they do is they collapse the burrow. They put up exclusion fencing so that the tortoise cannot go back to where the burrow was. They release the tortoise elsewhere on site, and then they can construct that pool in the area where the burrows were. So what this does is it reduces costs and reduces time on the homeowner. So it allows for this permit to significantly reduce costs. You don't have to pay a recipient site to receive the tortoise, which for other permits you do. You can release on site. The total cost for the permit is $207. So as opposed to that, we do have the conservation permit, which is meant for larger projects. This is for projects with more than 10 burrows on a site. Also, it's for phased developments that have previously obtained a 10 or fewer burrows permit. So if you have a subdivision going in, that's a phased subdivision. Let's say the first phase had 10 burrows on it and they applied for and received a 10 or fewer burrows permit. When they got to the second phase, there were still only 10 burrows in that second phase. They would have to apply for a conservation permit. You can't reapply for another 10 or fewer burrows permit. This allows the relocation of tortoises on-site or off-site as well, but there must be sufficient habitat, and usually with a larger scale project, there isn't sufficient habitat in most circumstances, so off-site relocation is more frequently used. Also, this permit requires that all relocation activities are conducted by an authorized agent. So, as opposed to the 10 or fewer burrows permit, for a conservation permit, the developer or whomever applies for the permit would have to pay the mitigation associated with the permit itself to FWC, which goes into a conservation fund for gopher tortoises. They would also have to hire an authorized agent, as well as pay a recipient site to receive the tortoises. So that's why we created the 10 or fewer burrows permit, to reduce all of those costs on single-family homeowners. There is also the conservation permit for public projects. So basically this allows the relocation of gopher tortoises from public projects, so if the city of Sebastian was building something, to contiguous public conservation lands. Let's say a natural area in Indian River County wanted to build a nature center or a trail or something that would impact gopher tortoise burrows, but there was contiguous public conservation land within a mile of that area. So it's not, literally contiguous, it's within a mile. They could move the gopher tortoises to that contiguous land rather than paying a recipient site to receive those tortoises. The recipient site must be designated as public conservation land or lands protected by a minimum 50-year conservation easement or lease. And this permit has benefits, both to the public entity that is applying for the permit, as well as to the tortoises. So what this does is it keeps tortoises on public lands within their home range. It also maintains local populations and genetic integrity. It minimizes stress on the tortoises because for another type of relocation permit, they can be moved up to 100 miles away to a recipient site. That's the maximum distance. So this allows them to be moved a mile or less away. It reduces a lot of stress on the tortoises. Also, it minimizes the potential for disease transmission, that URTD disease I mentioned earlier. There's less of a chance of the tortoises passing this disease along if one of them is infected, because chances are if they're being moved less than a mile away, those tortoises have already been exposed to it, if that's the case. Some populations are completely resistant to the disease. Others that have never seen the disease are exposed to it and have serious problems with it when a tortoise from another population enters that community. So this also aligns with and complements our existing gopher tortoise relocation options. So the benefits to a public entity I touched on before. There's the potential to reduce overall project costs at the local level, and that's mainly by not having to pay recipient sites to receive these tortoises. So I've mentioned recipient sites on multiple occasions during this presentation. There are several types of recipient sites that we permit. There is long-term recipient sites, short-term recipient sites, unprotected recipient sites, and public conservation lands. Long-term provides the highest conservation value for the gopher tortoise, and our permitting system is designed to provide financial incentives and advantages to landowners who establish long-term protected sites. So, because the long-term site provides the highest conservation value, it is the least expensive to relocate to. So an example of this would be if you were to have a project and apply for a conservation permit and you're relocating to a long-term site, you would pay $207 for the first 10 burrows. For each additional tortoise after that, you would pay $307. For a short-term site, on the other hand, you would pay $207 for the first 10 burrows and about $3,000 for each tortoise afterwards. So that is a permit-based incentive to relocate to a long-term recipient site. Long-term recipient sites are under perpetual conservation easement, so the land designated as a long-term site will forever be gopher tortoise habitat. It will never be developed. Also, there are stocking density benefits to long-term sites as opposed to short-term or unprotected sites, and that's based on habitat conditions. We do have a recipient site fact sheet available that has some of this information on it. I don't have any with me today because we didn't have any printed, but if you would like it, I can send it to you either digitally or we can send you hard copies in the mail, so just let me know. So for a long-term recipient site, on the left here, you can see the acceptable criteria. So a long-term site has to be a minimum of 40 acres. There must be 30% or greater herbaceous ground cover, 60% or less canopy cover, and a minimum 18-inch depth water table. In select cases in South Florida where the water table is naturally higher and tortoises are used to living in areas with a higher water table, we may allow a 12-inch depth water table. So the density is 2 tortoise per acre. That's the stocking density for a long-term recipient site. And then if you look on the right, any of these other desirable criteria you can meet for your recipient site. For each one that you can meet, you can get an additional half tortoise per acre stocking density. So if you had a recipient site that was 250 acres, had more than 50% herbaceous ground cover, less than 40% canopy cover, and a 130 centimeter depth water table, you could stock up to 4 tortoises per acre on that property. And the reason why this is important is because the majority of, well, not the majority, but a good portion of recipient sites that are created as a business. So people charge money to receive gopher tortoises on their site. If you have 250 acres, you can stock 1,000 tortoises on that property if you meet all these requirements. It's very rare that anybody gets the 4 tortoise per acre stocking density, but if you did, you could stock 1,000 tortoises on that property instead of 500, and people charge anywhere from $800 to $2,000 per tortoise. So on the same amount of land, you can stock almost double the amount of tortoises. And as I said, these are under perpetual conservation easement, so although it is a business, it is also great for gopher tortoises. So the short-term or unprotected recipient sites are 2 other types of recipient sites. These are actually 2 different permits. Short-term sites are, the permit is a 2-year agreement. That's the duration of the permit length. That's why they're called short-term sites. There's no perpetual conservation easement involved. Basically, the requirement for acreage is lower as well. You can have a short-term site that is 25 acres. So these are great for public entities, for local governments that want to create their own recipient site for public projects but can't commit to a perpetual conservation easement, or if they have a lot of 10 or fewer burrows permits for public projects. The herbaceous cover and the canopy cover requirements are the same as a long-term site, and the final stocking rate, no matter what, is 2 tortoises per acre. So you cannot stock more than 2 tortoises per acre. So if you have a 25-acre property, you could stock 50 tortoises on that property. Hence why it's good for a lot of 10 or fewer burrows permits that require offsite relocation. So it may not provide the highest conservation value, but it is essential for gopher tortoise conservation at the local level. So there are some financial considerations for establishing a recipient site. There's a one-time contribution for the permit mitigation of $515. That's what you pay to FWC to receive the permit. As I said before, that money goes into a conservation fund. Also, there's the installation of temporary enclosures or permanent fencing. So if you look at this photo here, you can see silt fencing. That is what we recommend to use because it's inexpensive, fairly easy to install. That's what we use on our recipient sites for the soft release of gopher tortoises. So soft release is a way of releasing gopher tortoises on a site so that they're, instead of just randomly being released onto the property where they can leave the property and go and get hit by cars or go into other populations or off the property itself, they are contained in a smaller area that is this soft release pen. So if you had a 40-acre long-term site, you might build a 10-acre soft release pen. The stocking density of the soft release pen is 3 tortoises per acre. So you could fit 30 tortoises in that soft release pen. If it was a 40-acre site with, let's say, 2 tortoises per acre, you could stock 80 total on the site. So it's just a portion of your total stocking density. But once that 30th tortoise was received, you would leave the fence up for 6 months, up to a maximum of 1 year. Then at that point, you lift up the silt fencing, you place it elsewhere to prepare to receive more tortoises, and those tortoises will walk around and do their own thing. By that point, they've become accustomed to the site, they've dug their own new burrows. Research shows that it's extremely effective at keeping tortoises on site and increasing site fidelity. So some people like to dig starter burrows for gopher tortoises as well. That's basically digging 2 or 3 feet into the ground at a 30-degree angle. Some research shows that they don't work at all. Some research shows that they work very well. It depends on the situation. It depends on where the tortoises are from and where they're going. The best research I've seen on the subject shows that if you dig a starter burrow within 2 or 3 feet of the silt fence, that's the most likely they have the highest percentage of being used. The reason for that is gopher tortoises have a really strong homing instinct, just like sea turtles that recruit back to the beach they were born on to lay their eggs. Gopher tortoises have a homing instinct where they're always looking for their burrow. So if you take gopher tortoises and you move them 100 miles away to a recipient site, first thing they're going to do when you release them is start looking for their burrow. That's where the silt fencing comes in handy. So what they'll do is they'll walk the perimeter of the silt fence area and they'll look for their burrow. After a few laps, they'll realize my burrow is not here. So eventually, they'll dig their own burrow. If you have a starter burrow for them, chances are higher that they'll take one of those starter burrows and they'll create a full burrow from that. Especially with juveniles and hatchlings that are released on sites, they're very susceptible to dehydration, predators, extreme temperatures. So it's better, we recommend that you dig starter burrows for them so that they have immediate cover. Whether or not they take the burrow and go with it, they'll at least have immediate cover in the short term. So some other considerations are habitat management. You do have to maintain that 30% herbaceous ground cover or 60% or less canopy cover if you have a recipient site. You also have to monitor the site and submit monitoring reports. So monitoring the tortoises that come into the site, you submit your initial monitoring reports every 3 years. Eventually, over time, that goes to every 10 years. There's a whole scale in our permitting guidelines that explain that. But there is the opportunity to generate revenue. So you can charge, if you're a public entity and you create a recipient site, you can charge to receive tortoises there, not only from your own public projects, but from anyone else who is relocating gopher tortoises. So you can charge $800 to $2,000 a tortoise to receive tortoises, and there's potential cost savings for your local public projects because you won't have to pay anyone else to receive or to place tortoises on their recipient site. So you're saving money by not having to pay recipient sites, and you're making money by charging others to receive them. So here you can see all of the recipient sites in Florida, the long-term sites. There are 31 of them. Most of them are in the peninsula. There is one in the Panhandle. Negosi Plantation has a long-term site. They've protected about 26,000 acres of habitat, and out of that, about 17,000 acres is gopher tortoise habitat. They do have the available capacity to receive 38,000 tortoises. So how do you establish a recipient site in your county? You can contact your regional gopher tortoise conservation biologist, which is Rachel King in the back of the room in the nice red shirt. That's Rachel. She is the South Region Gopher Tortoise conservation biologist, but she also handles Indian River County and a few other southern counties from the Northeast region. There would be an initial pre-screening phone call, a pre-application packet, and then a site review of the project site. Here are the list of all the regional gopher tortoise biologists in the state of Florida. Eric Seckinger handles the Northwest and North Central regions. Samantha Dupree handles the Northeast region, except for Brevard, Indian River, Orange, and Osceola. Eric Sievers is the Southwest Regional Gopher Tortoise biologist, and then Rachel King, as I mentioned, is the South Region. So the last permit I'm going to discuss before we take our break is the scientific collecting permit. This permit is specifically meant for scientific research, for the educational use of gopher tortoises, bless you, also for possession of a protected species. So it's not just for gopher tortoises, possession of any protected species, you can apply for a scientific collecting permit to have, but I'm going to specifically talk about this in relation to wave tortoises. So I mentioned wave tortoises briefly earlier. What wave tortoises are, in short, is that they're gopher tortoises that have been removed from their original location, their original habitat. They're not associated with the development project, and we have no idea where they came from. So this is basically when someone is driving down the side of the road, they see a gopher tortoise that lives in a right-of-way. They love to live in right-of-ways. It's open, grassy area, easily diggable, usually has great forage all around them, nice and sunny, and they live there. Now, if they're not in the road itself, there's no issue. Most of them are used to living on the side of roads, but people think that they don't belong there. They say, oh, that tortoise is going to get hit by a car. So they pick the tortoise up, put it in their car, which is against the law. Then they take it to a wildlife rehabber or a vet or something of that nature, and they drop it off and they don't say where they got it from. Or the vet doesn't know, or the rehabber doesn't know to ask that question. So at that point, this is designated as a wave tortoise. Now the problem with this is that we can't release that tortoise just at any public lands or natural area. That tortoise can introduce URTD or other diseases to the existing tortoise population. That tortoise may compete for food or resources with the existing tortoise population, mates, land. Some areas have a small patch of gopher tortoise habitat surrounded by wetlands or other areas that aren't habitable for gopher tortoises, so they do compete for space. You'll see areas that have, on 2 acres, there's 100 tortoises, and they're all, all the burrows are dug really close together. That's because the surrounding habitat isn't good. There's lots of problems with these wave tortoises, so the best thing to do is, if the tortoise is injured, take it to a rehabber, but if you just see one on the side of the road that's not in any immediate danger, leave it be. So we do have permits for these wave tortoises when they become wave tortoises. One is the wave recipient site. The wave recipient site was specifically meant to accommodate those tortoises that we don't know where they came from, so that they are not just dumped on random public lands. So this is a great permit for any landowner, whether you're public or private, that's unable to meet the requirements of a long-term or short-term site, but you would like to help with gopher tortoise conservation. So basically, a wave recipient site can be for public or private lands. There's no cost for the permit. It is a free permit. There's minimal requirements, so you don't have to meet the same requirements as a long-term site, that 30% herbaceous cover, 60% or less canopy cover. As long as we determine through a site visit that it's somewhat suitable habitat for gopher tortoises, considering that these are wave tortoises, you could get a permit for a wave site, but it doesn't include financial incentives, so you can't charge to receive these tortoises. You're doing it just for the conservation of the species. Now, if you're a private landowner, you can apply for this permit, or if you're a public landowner, if you're a city of Sebastian, for example, you could create a wave site as well. There is a fact sheet on wave sites and wave gopher tortoises, and once again, we don't have it printed. I apologize for that, so if you would like it, I can email it to you or print them and send to you. So the other type of site that doesn't necessarily have to do with wave tortoises is the incidental take permit recipient site. So I mentioned earlier that since 2007, all impacts to gopher tortoises and their burrows require a FWC permit to relocate them. Prior to 2007, we granted incidental take permits. That basically stated that if you were conducting construction activities and there were gopher tortoise burrows in the way of construction incidental to your project, you could take those burrows if you paid for this permit. So basically what it was a large mitigation contribution, and a developer would receive this permit. They could collapse all the burrows that were incidental to their development, and they didn't relocate them. So the issue with this is that these permits are perpetual, so as long as the project has not been completed, the permit is still active. So a lot of projects are still only 25% built out or 50% built out. So what we're doing is we actually had one of our interns go through all of the incidental take permits and rank them according to priority based on how many possible tortoises could be impacted by that development and based on how far along, how far built out the project was. So anything 50% or less built out was considered a priority, and anything that would impact, over 100 tortoises was considered a priority. So we first assessed the top 10% of projects, which was 345 permits. Then we recently did the second 10%, and what we're doing is we contact each of these landowners who have this incidental take permit, and we ask them if they would be willing to allow FWC to relocate the tortoises at no cost to them. So we're trying to relocate the tortoises and kind of fix our mistakes in the past by relocating these tortoises. Excuse me. The areas they go to are incidental take permit recipient sites. So if a public landowner is looking to restore lands, let's say you have a natural area that has no gopher tortoise populations, but it is gopher tortoise habitat, you're trying to restore the habitat, this would be the perfect permit for you because you could receive tortoises at no cost and help to improve the ecosystem through placing gopher tortoises on it, because they are ecosystem engineers as well. So the ITP recipient site requires a minimum of 100 acres. And that's based on the minimum viable population for gopher tortoises, which is listed as 250 gopher tortoises on 250 acres or more. We're trying to establish more minimum viable populations in Florida, and that has to do with the federal listing of the species. So the idea is that if you have 100 acres, the surrounding habitat will also have gopher tortoises, and it's a start in working towards that 250 acres to create a minimum viable population. There's no cost, and there's also no permit. So this, although I call it an incidental take recipient site permit, it's not really a permit. What it is it's a letter of agreement. The entity that wants to create a site like this just signs a letter of agreement saying that they're willing to accept tortoises in the foreseeable future. Other than that, there's similar requirements to the other recipient sites, mainly the long-term site with the canopy cover, depth of water table, soils, etc. Excuse me. Also, it doesn't include financial incentives. So you can't charge to receive these tortoises either. There is a financial reimbursement available for silt fencing installation because we do require silt fencing on these sites as well. If you look on the back table, we have our Habitat Management Assistance Funding applications, which is a reimbursement program that FWC offers. And now we've added a section in that if you sign a letter of agreement to be an ITP recipient site, you can receive money for the installation of silt fencing as a reimbursement. All right, so that was the end of permitting. I told you that's about halfway through the presentation. So we can take a short break. We have a clock, so it's 10:11 right now. Why don't we come back at 10:15? If anybody else wants to stay and ask questions, if you don't want to use the restroom, by the way, the restrooms are right out this door if you're not familiar with the building. Feel free, if you want to grab a drink or do whatever, do that as well. Thank you. They love to dig up against. All right, everyone, I think we're going to get started again. Short break, I know, but the rest of it isn't too much longer, although it looks very long. All right, so the next conservation action that we're going to discuss is local government coordination, which is the purpose of this workshop to begin with. So, coordination between FWC and local governments is essential to the conservation of and management of the Gopher tortoise. So how can FWC help governments with, how can FWC help local governments with Gopher tortoise conservation? So how can the FWC help you? One is by participating in community workshops, such as this one that you're all in today. So we do host these local government workshops every year. I usually host anywhere between 6 and 7 of these, so this is actually my 7th one this summer, so you guys are last but not least for sure. We also serve as resources for partner agencies, and we attend and present at various other events as well. We can provide you with technical assistance, such as providing input on planning directives, providing guidance for future land use compatibility, also assisting with the development of codes and ordinances. So if you need assistance with developing codes, local codes, as far as Gopher tortoises are concerned, any development, we can assist with that, and that's what we're here for. Also, I'll discuss an ordinance on the next slide, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. We also are a landowner resource guide for Gopher tortoise conservation, and we provide habitat management assistance funding. I'll mention this several times in the rest of the presentation, and we'll discuss them when we get to the incentive section. So I mentioned that we can assist with the development of codes and ordinances. We do have a template available if you would like to pass an ordinance locally. This right here is the Volusia County Ordinance, which was passed in 2010. I can send you this ordinance as a template if you would like to receive it. Basically, the ordinance, in short, instead of reading through all of this, what it does is it established a GIS map of priority habitat throughout the entire county, Volusia County, and any area that is going to be developed within this potential gopher tortoise habitat, if it is being developed by a single-family homeowner, it would require the 100% borough survey to be conducted on the site before development is allowed. So what that does is it ensures that if there are any gopher tortoises on the property at the local level, it is monitored that you ensure this property does have gopher tortoises on it. You need to get an FWC relocation permit. So for single family homeowners, what it does is it charges them a very small fee, and then the Volusia County Environmental Permitting would come out and conduct the survey, so it wouldn't require a homeowner to do the survey. And then they would be notified whether or not they would need state permits before their local building permit would be granted. For larger scale development projects, it requires the developer to do a 100% survey of the property if it falls within potential gopher tortoise habitat. And then it also would require them, if they found any gopher tortoises on the site, to obtain all necessary state permits before moving forward with the development permit. There's also a couple other things that it does. So it establishes requirements for barriers and used for borough exclusion, and establishes a notification protocol to Volusia County Environmental Permitting in the case of the take of a borough. So this is probably the best thing you can do locally if you want to ensure that all development coincides with receiving the required by state law FWC relocation permit if there are gopher tortoises on a property. So the issue is that although FWC has jurisdiction over the species, the gopher tortoise as a species, and we require the relocation of all tortoises impacted within 25 feet, whether on-site or off-site, a lot of people do not obtain these permits and claim that they don't know about the permits, even though they do know in many circumstances, and they just choose not to get a gopher tortoise relocation permit. If you're caught in the act, you could be liable for criminal charges. And if we find out about it, you'll have to obtain a disturbed site permit, which is extremely expensive. So it's better to just follow the law than try to circumvent it and get caught. What this does, though, is it prevents that from being a possibility because the county will not issue a building permit unless you receive a FWC gopher tortoise relocation permit, if you're within potential habitat. So we don't only help with ordinances, we help with the we can provide this proclamation for Gopher Tortoise Day. So it was originally pronounced by the Gopher Tortoise Council, which is a multi-state volunteer council on the conservation of gopher tortoises, that April 10th would be declared Gopher Tortoise Day. We kind of ran with that and created this Florida Gopher Tortoise Day website that includes a resolution template for any cities, counties, nature centers, any entities that want to officially adopt April 10th as Gopher Tortoise Day. What this does is it raises awareness for the species. The website lists ways that you can host events and impact gopher tortoises positively. There is a resolution template that was passed by the city of Northport last year, as well as the city of Venice. There's a tab on how to host an event that includes sample activities, including field trip activities, how to build an interactive gopher tortoise burrow for children, which we have, so we provided the instructions and the materials that you can use to create that, as well as all associated costs. Lots of other activities, also just general information on how to host an event, whether you're a local government or whether you're a nature center or other entity. Also, there's a tab for educational materials, which has all of the educational materials that are on the back table today, as well as the ones that aren't printed, that I apologize for, as well as activity books and coloring books and things for kids. And there's this really, really great fun fact section that I put together based on questions that the public have asked us about gopher tortoises. So some of those are pretty funny. You can check that out if you'd like to, but all this information is available on the website. You can either Google Gopher Tortoise Day Florida or go to this website right here. Also, that was an intern project. So that was another intern project that was done last spring. And we're hoping to get more people to adopt the resolution before April 10th of this year. So if anybody's interested, please let me know. So we have Gopher Tortoise information sources. Information is continually updated at myfwc.com/gophertortoise. Also, we have launched our GovDelivery listserv to manage our digital communications. Some of you may have received notifications of this workshop through our GovDelivery email list. So you can sign up for this if you go, as I showed you before, to our main website, click sign up for updates. One of those boxes you can check to receive updates from is the local government Gopher Tortoise contact list. So that's how FWC can help local governments. How can local governments help with Gopher Tortoise conservation? How can you help the FWC? One is by staying current with FWC regulations. That's a big one. Also, coordinating to ensure that local policies are consistent with the goals and objectives of the Gopher Tortoise Management Plan. So that would be ensuring that Gopher Tortoise burrow surveys are conducted prior, or any environmental survey is conducted prior to a development permit is granted, things of that nature. Something to help as you manage your local lands to help ensure that listed species permits are applied for. Also, you can establish policies that focus on habitat for Gopher Tortoise, listed commensals, and other imported listed wildlife. Local government approval is another way that local governments can help with Gopher Tortoise conservation. So we require proof of local government approval to be submitted for FWC permits that authorize off-site relocation. Basically what this does is it helps to ensure that relocation is the final action prior to site disturbance. So what that does is it minimizes the unnecessary relocation of tortoises off of a site, and it prevents it minimizes the chances of the tortoises recruiting back to the site. So local government approval can basically be the approval to develop a piece of property. So it's basically granting a building permit. If you provide that to us, we require that you provide that to us before we grant our FWC. Well, we grant our FWC relocation permit, but a permit condition is that we require local government approval before the tortoises are relocated off-site. And what that does is, let's say if we didn't do that, if we just said go ahead and relocate the tortoises whenever the building permit's issued, or before the building permit's issued, it might be 6 months before a developer actually develops that land. If they had already relocated those tortoises, more tortoises might recruit onto the site, then all those tortoises would be impacted by the development. Or the developer may run out of funding, or for some reason choose not to go forward with the project, so all the tortoises that were relocated for no reason because the project never took place. So by asking for local government approval before we grant the ability to relocate the tortoises, it prevents that from taking place. And if a local government doesn't issue this type of approval, a letter or email sent to FWC instead will work in its place. So you can provide us with your input as well. We do request input from stakeholders, local governments, and the general public on revisions to our major documents. You can also attend those GT tag meetings, the Gopher Tortoise Technical Assistance Group that I mentioned earlier, and become a member of the local government interest group. So as I said, there are multiple interest groups, and one of them is specifically for local governments. Excuse me. You can educate local residents. So this, in my opinion, is one of the most important things you can do to assist with Gopher Tortoise conservation, whether you're a local government, just a citizen who wants to do the right thing, anything you can do to inform people on the rules, regulations, the importance of the species. That, to me, is the most important thing you can do. So reminding residents that Gopher tortoises and their burrows are protected by law. That's very important. Most people don't know that their burrows are protected. They know that the tortoise is, but not the burrow. Also providing information to landowners, builders, and residents about the regulations and mitigation options. Looking for burrows when conducting site visits and notifying FWC staff of where burrows have been documented. Right now, the city of Northport is doing that by creating GIS maps of the city for internal use of all documented burrows on all platted lots. So they have basically a map of the entire city of where all Gopher Tortoise burrows have been found, so they know exactly where burrows are if any development is to take place on those lots. Also reporting suspected wildlife violations to the FWC Wildlife Alert Hotline. So that phone number is 888-404-3922. That goes directly to law enforcement. A dispatcher will contact the local law enforcement officer that's patrolling the area and have them sent out to a scene if you suspect a wildlife violation has occurred, and they will investigate that. If it's something about nuisance wildlife, it'll be transferred to the Wildlife Assistance Program. So you can provide protected and managed areas for Gopher tortoises. You can establish land development code incentives So you may require a monetary donation for land development projects. So anytime development takes place, a small fee is, or tariff, I guess, is included that would go towards creating habitat for gopher tortoises or for managing existing habitat. You can also establish recipient sites. So I mentioned that earlier. That helps to retain local populations. Also, it's a way to generate revenue for the local government, whether you use it for habitat management or not, and a way to minimize the cost of relocating gopher tortoises from public projects. So now we'll discuss habitat preservation and management as conservation actions. So since 2007, the state had acquired about 32,000 acres through Florida Forever. That was 5% of the goal of acquired lands from our management plan. So we only achieved 5% before Florida Forever was defunded. So we implemented these other conservation actions to increase habitat for gopher tortoises to meet the 95% that we didn't meet through Florida Forever, through conservation easements, conservation banks, military buffering. So an example of that would be around an area like Eglin Air Force Base or Canaveral Air Force Base or something like that. The buffer zone, managing habitat for gopher tortoises in those areas to increase the populations. And if you're interested in any of these that are listed, they're all in our management plan, so you can find our management plan on our website and specifically look at these. Also, Amendment 1 funding may assist with new habitat acquisition. So we do implement appropriate habitat management on upland communities. We also work with local governments to identify management assistance needs. And we provide funding for fire strike teams through the Nature Conservancy. Those are people conducting controlled burns. Also, we provide habitat management assistance funding, which, as I said, I'll discuss in the incentive section. So, some conservation actions of population management and disease management. We do assist in population restoration. I've mentioned how we do it, but basically we do it through directed and facilitated restocking. Directed is when you physically take tortoises and relocate them to an area to restock them. An example of that would be the agreement we have with South Carolina. We are restocking tortoise populations there where they've been depleted. Also our recipient sites in Florida, those are in areas, one of the requirements of a recipient site is that it has a low existing tortoise population, same with WAIF recipient sites. So we are moving tortoises to where they've been depleted. Also, we have facilitated population restoration, which is basically managing habitat in hopes that the surrounding populations of gopher tortoises will move on to that habitat once it becomes suitable for them. So, and a good example of that would be the habitat management assistance funding that we use. We do have a disease educational campaign. We have a mortality event database, which is on our website. You can go on our website if you ever find a deceased gopher tortoise, whether it's been hit by a car or it died from some other cause. You can, there's a map on that website. You basically drag the cursor on the map to your location and to your name if you'd like to, any contact information, and it'll record the mortality and put it into GPS points so that our biologists can assess where there's hot spots of gopher tortoise mortality. Every semester, for the most part, I work with one of my interns to create a mortality map of all the mortalities that have taken place since the past year, and we map those and look for hot spots along roadways or in natural areas where there may be a potential for URTD outbreak. We also have a protocol for accommodating ill tortoises, and we also have a mortality contingency plan for large-scale gopher tortoise mortalities. In case there was ever a large-scale die-off due to URTD, we do have a contingency plan on how to contain the disease, how to make sure that the disease isn't spreading, things of that nature, and that was also created by one of my interns. They do a lot. So we've made it to the incentives portion as a conservation action. We have 3 permit-based incentives. One is waive permit requirements for habitat improvements. Also, we have increased stocking densities on approved recipient sites that exceed the minimum. I discussed that when we talked about long-term recipient sites, the extra half tortoise per acre that you could get for each of the additional characteristics met. Also, we have smaller mitigation for responsible relocations. I kind of touched on that. That's if you relocate to a long-term site, you pay the $300 per tortoise after 10 burrows. For short-term, you pay $3,000. And then for unprotected, which is very, very rare, we've never actually relocated tortoises to an unprotected area, but it would be $3,000 per tortoise starting from the first tortoise. So that first 10 burrows doesn't apply. Also, there are candidate conservation agreements. These can be a little tricky. Basically, the purpose of this is to prevent the federal listing of a candidate species. So as the gopher tortoise is a candidate species for federal listing right now that's precluded, this agreement is between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and different public or private parties. So there is a gopher tortoise CCA. It was implemented in December of 2008, and it's between all the states within the range of the gopher tortoise, so Florida, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, well, I guess not Louisiana. I feel like Louisiana's in it too. I might have just forgot that. The Department of Defense, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and several non-governmental organizations. There's also CCAs with assurances, and these are the differences between the two. So a CCA is between federal and non-federal landowners, so the federal government and the non-federal states. There's a memorandum of agreement that lists what will take place within the CCAA or the CCA. There's a no-take authorization to not take gopher tortoises. Also, basically what it does is you put together all your management actions to manage for gopher tortoises to prevent the listing of the species, and you work with the federal government and the other states or non-governmental organizations involved to try to prevent the listing of the species. A CCAA, on the other hand, is for non-federal landowners. Basically, it's the exact same thing, but it provides assurances, which is that last A, and what that does is if the species were to become listed during the process, during the 10-year agreement that's involved during a CCA, you would not have to abide by any of those additional restrictions. So for a gopher tortoise, which is a candidate species, if you were in a CCAA, you would do everything you can to prevent the listing of the species, habitat management, improving populations, increasing them, etc. And if for some reason, no matter what you were doing, the species were to become federally listed in the process, any additional restrictions on your property due to the species becoming federally listed, you would not have to abide by during the agreement period. And this also authorizes specific levels of take rather than no take, except for gopher tortoises. So it's a little confusing. If anybody wants more information on this, you can talk to me after the presentations. So Camp Blanding has a CCAA. They are a Florida National Guard training facility in Clay County. Basically, what they've done is they've managed habitat through all these means you can see here: wiregrass planting, longleaf pine planting, thinning, clear cuts. They managed about 914 acres as of 2012. I wasn't able to find a report after 2012, so I'm sure they've managed a lot more since then. But the majority of their management has taken place through prescribed burns and habitat maintenance based on herbicide treatment of oaks and invasives. So you can see they managed about 6,300 acres through those means as of 2012. And in this circumstance, the prescribed fire that takes place at Camp Blanding isn't the normal prescribed fire that you would normally imagine, where people light specific fires in mosaic forms or however to burn habitat. It's more of choosing a specific area of the base to launch ammunition into, because it is a training facility for the National Guard. So at the last CCA meeting, we discussed that with the gentleman who represents Camp Blanding, and he told us about that, which we thought was very interesting. So I've mentioned FWC's Habitat Management Assistance Program on multiple occasions during this presentation. We do provide funding for local governments to increase or improve gopher tortoise habitat, and this comes directly from the Gopher Tortoise Conservation Program. It is a reimbursement of up to $15,000 per year for habitat assistance. It's for public entities only, not private landowners. Basically, it's used to help optimize carrying capacity on protected lands through appropriate habitat management. It's also meant to help prepare habitat to be a future recipient site. So if you're thinking about creating a long-term site, but you don't have the funding or would like additional funding to manage that property to eventually create a long-term site, you could apply for this funding every year until you met the requirements, the 30% herbaceous ground cover and the less than 60% canopy cover, by receiving the $15,000 each year. And the activities that you can conduct are basically any habitat management activities that benefit gopher tortoises. So the deadline for applications this year is September 4th, and then funded projects would be completed by May 19th. So the way it works is you apply, there is a review panel that goes over all applications that are submitted. We choose the ones that we feel would benefit gopher tortoises the most, and then Those projects receive a purchase order for whatever amount of money they apply for, up to $15,000. They conduct their projects, and then on May 19th, they submit their final reports and invoices, and they are reimbursed for the funds that were listed in the purchase order. I do have a list of the 2015-2016 projects, the specific management activities that took place, the funding that was requested, the funding they actually received, et cetera. It's all on a spreadsheet on the back table there. So, this is the short version of that spreadsheet. So in the past fiscal year, we received 17 applications. 9 of those projects were funded. It's all based on our total amount of funding available for the year. The projects that were funded are listed here. There was one in Brevard County, Cruikshank Sanctuary. Also, there were basically projects representing counties all over the state of Florida, a few in St. Lucie County as well. We provided nearly $72,000 for Gopher Tortoise habitat management, just under that, and that's due to some projects not being able to take place because a lot of them applied to do prescribed burns, which, although they have the greatest benefit for gopher tortoises, the conditions aren't always perfect to be able to actually conduct the burns on the acreage that is applied for. So that's why we didn't quite provide as much funding as previous years. But you can see below some of the activities that were conducted: fire line maintenance and controlled burns, mowing, roller chopping, mulching, chemical treatments, selective tree removal, usually by chainsaw, as well as the planting of native species. So another program that is available, an incentive program available through the federal government, is the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. This is available to private landowners as well as landowners considered partners by the service. You can go on their website to find out more about that. Basically, the greatest part about this program is that it's voluntary and there's no application period. So if you're interested in this program, you can apply for it year-round. You just have to contact the Partners program. I have the list of contacts on a fact sheet on the back table, and I'll show you here in a minute on the presentation. There is an emphasis placed on projects that benefit the federal trust resources, which includes federally listed species or candidate species like the gopher tortoise. Funding is not available to purchase land use rights, so no conservation easements. And basically what it is you enter a 10-year agreement with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to manage habitat on your land to accommodate the listed species or whatever federal trust resource that you'd like. Also, there's a 50-50 cost share, so you would be providing 50% of the funding to do the activities, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would provide the other 50%. And you must have reasonable access to your property. So if your property is only accessible by helicopter, you're probably not going to get the funding. So it's not just for upland restoration. You can also use this funding for wetland, stream, and shoreline restoration, soil restorations, all different activities. Here are some of the activities that you could conduct: prescribed burns, hardwood control, invasive species control, and the rest that you see here. The website is listed below, fws.gov/partners. And here are the regional contacts for the state of Florida. So I believe this is technically the North region. Let's see, yep, no, you are the South region. So this is technically the South region, but borders the North region for people who might not be from Indian River County. And this is on the back of that fact sheet that I explained is on the back table. So for monitoring and research, we do track progress towards meeting our conservation objectives. We implement line transect distance sampling, survey methodology, not so much for the donor sites, as those burrows will be collapsed eventually, but what this transect methodology is that instead of just conducting a belt transect where you count the number of burrows on a property, you actually scope every burrow that's found using a burrow scope to determine the actual population of tortoises on a property. So as I said before, tortoises can have multiple burrows. So when you get a burrow survey done, you can estimate what the population is, but you truly just know the number of burrows on a property. If you scope every single burrow, you for the most part know what the population of tortoises is on that property because you find tortoises inside the burrows. And also you count the tortoises that you find while walking along to scope those burrows. So that's more for research purposes or for recipient sites, tracking and monitoring recipient sites as well. The main reason we're trying to implement this, not only in Florida, but throughout the entire species range, is because right now, for federal listing purposes, there is no distinct methodology for conducting burrow surveys. So once there is a uniform methodology, it'll be easier to assess whether or not this species requires federal listing. We also use GIS to assess population statuses, and we directly monitor the health and stability of gopher tortoise populations. We track the number of tortoises relocated to recipient sites, and we track the continual management of those sites. So we do have a new GIS and monitoring coordinator. This is a newly created position with our program. It's Michaelina Giaggio. She's been with us for 2 or 3 months now. Her contact information is listed here, but if you have any GIS information, including burrow surveys that you'd like to provide to us, we do keep a burrow survey workspace using GIS for all burrow surveys submitted to us throughout the state of Florida to help us assess the population and where gopher tortoise burrows are occurring. Also, if you would like any information, we can send this information to you as well. So finally, education and outreach as a conservation action. We conduct a lot of education and outreach. I work with 2 interns every semester to conduct outreach within an hour of Tallahassee, which is where I'm stationed out of. Also throughout the rest of Florida, our regional gopher tortoise conservation biologists are available to conduct outreach presentations as well. The majority of us have these beautiful gopher tortoise treasure chests, which you can see on the tables here. It consists of all different gopher tortoise shells and artifacts, eggshell fragments, commensal species, snake skin sheds, also a rattlesnake, snake skin, gopher tortoise scat, pit tags, all little artifacts and things that we use for gopher tortoises. Also, in Tallahassee, we have an educational tortoise, Scooter, named that because she scoots and she has scoots. So she's our star of every show. She is an educational tortoise. She's about 10 years old, so she's a sub-adult. She was born in captivity, so she's non-releasable. She's been in captivity her entire life. She was confiscated by someone who had her illegally. So she lives in the office, and now she comes to all of our outreach presentations. So here you can see the top left is the Liberty County 4-H camp. We do a lot of 4-H camps in the summertime. These kids live in a very rural area and are rarely exposed to this type of education, so we try to hit these places specifically to hopefully raise future conservationists. And these kids were very excited watching Scooter eat some strawberries, I think, yes. On the right, that was the SEEK conference at Wakulla Springs. That was specifically environmental educators and high school students from around the state of Florida attending this conference. So we presented there as well. And those are just 2 examples of many, many, many that we conduct. We usually conduct anywhere from 4 to 7 outreach events each semester. So it's, maybe 28 a year just in Tallahassee. Here you can see that life-size, human-size gopher tortoise interactive burrow on the top left photo that I mentioned earlier. That was created by my predecessor, Allie Perryman, who now works with the Florida's Wildlife Legacy Initiative. The burrow is made out of burlap and PVC pipes. It's got little burrow commensals, like you can see in the bottom left picture, all through the burrow. There's a little scarab beetle there. On the top, you can see a butterfly and a praying mantis that are stapled onto it. There's also stuffed animals. We've got a raccoon and a possum and a burrowing owl and a stuffed gopher tortoise, of course, that we keep in the back of the burrow. And then we've got a coral snake and a rattlesnake, rubber one. Sometimes the kids don't want to go into the burrow because they think that they're real, even though we tell them multiple times they're not. Main issue with this is kids want to run away with all the stuffed animals, so we have to chase them down while trying to educate other stakeholders on the importance of gopher tortoises. That can be an issue. But it's very beneficial, and we do have instructions on how to build this, as well as the cost associated with it and the materials needed. On the right, you can see we do go to different classes. This is Project Learning Tree that we do in Crawfordville, Florida, at Crawfordville Elementary and Riverside Elementary. It's part of a basically a science education program that they have there, but we go every semester and teach the kids about gopher tortoises. So we also supply schools with educational materials. We have this activity book that you can see, that's the top right photo. That was actually created by a student out of Sarasota, Florida a few years back, a high school student. The illustrations are really, really good, and it's got lots of activities on the inside. We do have those available if you'd like them. They're on our website, and we can also send them to you. The bottom left shows our Gopher Tortoise Field Trip Guide, which was also created by one of our interns. It's got how to identify different animal tracks in the wild, different activities and, to conduct at field trips, doing field exercises. It's very interactive and really cool. We also have that on our website as well. We have a Gopher Tortoise curriculum, which is, we have a facilitator version and an educator version if anybody wants to teach a class on Gopher Tortoises. It comes with a presentation as well as materials and different activities that you can conduct with your classroom. So I do have some of those CDs as well if anybody's interested in them. We have coloring sheets. Really, there's 4 separate coloring sheets we put together in Call A Coloring Book. One's of a gopher tortoise, one's of a burrow, one's of a rattlesnake, and one's of a gopher frog. So we do have those available as well. And of course, all the fact sheets and brochures that are on the back table, as well as on our website. We have a Safe Roads campaign to aid in preventing tortoise mortality on roadways. Safe Roads both for people and tortoises placard, that is on the back table as well. The short of what this placard says is if you see a gopher tortoise crossing the road, you can move it across the road in the direction that it's going, but of course never put your own life in danger, and make sure that you move it in the direction it's going. As I said, gopher tortoises have that strong homing instinct. If you turn them around, they're just going to cross the road all over again. Also, if it's a tortoise on the side of the road that's not crossing the road, please leave it be. So we do collect road mortality research via not only our online mortality database, but also directly from wildlife rehabilitators, local governments, state parks, and the Florida Department of Transportation. So if anybody has any mortality data, whether it's from roadways or from diseases or other causes of death, predation, please let us know. We have a Tortoise-Wise community program for conserving gopher tortoises in neighborhoods. There's this really cool Florida guide to gopher tortoise friendly plants list that you can get on our website, and that was put together in combination with Pat Ashton and one of our interns. Basically, what it does is it lists by region all the plants that you can grow that gopher tortoises like to forage on, as well as the nutritional value of those plants for gopher tortoises. And that's available on our website under the How You Can Help tab. So for anybody who wants to plant Florida gopher tortoise friendly plants in their backyard, you can go ahead and use that. We also have a campaign to keep dogs away from gopher tortoises. We have this wonderful urban areas fact sheet that's available on the back table. Although it's called urban areas, it's really intended to prevent animal tortoise interactions, domesticated animal tortoise interactions. Gopher tortoises and dogs do not mix. We do get a lot of calls of tortoises having their limbs bitten off by dogs. So this fact sheet explains some ways that you can prevent your pet from interacting with the gopher tortoise. There are several ways to do that. If anybody wants to talk about that with me after the presentation, please do so. So we also have citizen science volunteer programs. The first one I've discussed, the Gopher Tortoise Mortality website. That's completely voluntary. You don't need to sign up for that. But the other 3, we do require you to sign a volunteer agreement with the FWC. The Tortoise Taxi program is used to transport tortoises from wildlife rehabilitators to those WAIF recipient sites that I mentioned, which makes it easier on the rehabber as well as the WAIF recipient site manager. The silt fence installation program reduces labor costs for those creating WAIF recipient sites by allowing volunteers to work to put those silt fence in. Saves labor costs and time usually for the WAIF recipient site manager. Also, we have the ITP relocation program, which is our newest program for those ITP recipient sites I mentioned. We are allowing volunteers to conduct burrow surveys on the donor site, so on the actual incidental take permitted development site, they can go conduct burrow surveys and assist with moving the project along faster so that more developers agree to relocate tortoises to these recipient sites rather than take them incidentally. And we have a citizen science smartphone app available for both Android and iPhone. So you can pull out your shell phones and take photos of gopher tortoises. So basically this app is meant to take photos of gopher tortoises only. Please no selfies, we will not approve those photos. Also, we will not approve photos of gopher tortoise burrows because, there is an interactive map that all the photos go onto, so we don't want to display photos of gopher tortoise burrows all over the state of Florida for obvious reasons. People might go and try to take eggs from those burrows or might try to eat the gopher tortoises in those burrows. So just photos of gopher tortoises, the rest will not be approved. But you can go to this interactive map after you take a photo. Any of the dots that you click on, any of the GPS points will show the exact photo of the gopher tortoise that was submitted. So this kind of helps everyone to realize where gopher tortoises are within the state and where they've been submitted. So for more information, you can visit our website at myfwc.com/gophertortoise. For general questions relating to the program, you can call our main office line at 850-921-1030. You can contact your regional Gopher Tortoise conservation biologist, which is Rachel King, for any permitting questions. And for all other questions, you can contact me, Alex Calfin, the local government coordinator. My phone number is 850-921-1145, and I do have cards on the back table as well. For any wildlife violations or suspected wildlife violations, you can either go to our website, myfwc.com/contact/wildlife alert, excuse me, or you can call the wildlife alert hotline number listed below. And thank you very much for your participation in this workshop. I know that my presentation was very long and this doesn't want to play for some reason, but that tortoise walks and it's pretty cute. But next up, we'll have Heather come and talk about the Wildlife Legacy Initiative, and then Tim Towles will come talk about the Wildlife Assistance Program. Then we'll have time for some questions, and we'll get out to look at some burrows in their natural setting. So thank you very much. Thanks for the golf clap. All right. So and this, you kind of flick it towards you to move this line.
Podium microphone? Okay. I'll leave this one. Okay, good morning. My name is Heather Hitt, and I am a biologist with the Florida Wildlife Legacy Initiative, which is a program within FWC. And today I just have a short presentation to show you how local governments and other partners can work with FWC on various wildlife and habitat conservation in Florida, other than just gopher tortoises, which are important too. There we go. So our program, I went too far. In short, what is Florida Wildlife Legacy Initiative? It's a program designed to combine effective statewide planning with regional partnership. We focus statewide and try to work with several partners throughout the state to implement actions at the local level. And we consider ourselves, we like to call it a three-legged stool. We work with the State Wildlife Action Plan, which was originally written and approved in 2005. Every state in the U.S. and our territories have to have one in order to receive state wildlife grants, and that goes through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Every 10 years they have to be updated in order to continue to receive state wildlife grant program funding, and that funding comes from the federal, state, and tribal wildlife grants program, which provides financial support for actions that are identified in our plan. And the third leg of our stool is partnerships. With a statewide plan, there's no way we could identify and implement all the actions in that plan, so we rely heavily on partnerships to help us complete those actions, either through our grants program or just with activities that you all are already doing. So since 2002, which is when we first received state wildlife grants, we've worked with over 150 partners on 235 or more projects, and that represents about $33 million in state wildlife grants that's come to Florida, and we've leveraged $20 million in match from partners, including the Gopher Tortoise Mitigation Program, and that resulted in about $53 million in conservation and research projects on the ground based on our State Wildlife Action Plan. So since we can't address every action in the plan, we develop these implementation goals based on the highest priorities in the plan, and these are the current goals that we're working under. We have revising the action plan is one of our goals, since we have to do it every 10 years anyway. And we have research, species and habitat monitoring and climate adaptation data gaps to help acquire information on species that are in need of conservation. Marine goal to improve coral reef restoration. We have a freshwater goal to improve conditions, stream quality and habitat for fish. and other species that live in rivers and streams, and the terrestrial goal, which I particularly work on to improve or increase the use of fire as a management tool on conservation and private lands. So each legacy biologist, and we have one in each of our FWC regions, works on one of these goals. So if you have an idea for a project that addresses one of these goals, you would contact the appropriate person. Not all of our SWIG or State Wildlife Grant projects go through a general request for proposal process. So we'd like to hear from partners on project ideas. And like I mentioned, the terrestrial goal is the one that I work on. It's a statewide goal, so it's not just in the Northeast region, even though I'm located in the Northeast region. And I have a flyer on some burn teams that we've funded with the help of Gopher Tortoise mitigation on where they're located and what they can do to help if you're a land manager who does prescribe burning on your property or has difficulty and needs help with it. Let's see. So the State Wildlife Action Plan, again, was originally approved in 2005. FWC completed a minor revision in 2012, and we're currently in the middle of a major revision scheduled to be completed in 2017. And the goal of this revision is to make this plan more user-friendly. Right now, it's like a giant document that nobody wants to go through. So we're trying to make it more useful for our partners. We're going to try to identify regional priorities as well as our statewide priorities, which is a requirement. Part of the State Wildlife Action Plan is this Species of Greatest Conservation Need List. One of the main purposes of the State Wildlife Grants program is to proactively conserve species before they become listed on the Endangered Species Act. So the Species of Greatest Conservation Need List is designed for species that are at risk of becoming imperiled, not necessarily the ones that already are, even though we include all the state threatened and endangered, all the state listed species. So in this revision, we're trying to better comply with the intent of that program. Originally, we had a huge list. We didn't really have very strict way to put them on the list. So now we're revising that policy on how stricter data-driven, more consistent standards across taxa. So that list is probably going to go from over 1,000 species down to 550, which will help us show a greater impact on species conservation to our policymakers, since this program actually doesn't receive dedicated funding, and being able to show a greater success is an important story. And you can contact Allie Perryman, who used to work in Alex's position, on the revisions that we're doing with the action plan and the species list. And I have a flyer in the back on a webinar that's coming up soon about revising that list. And like I mentioned, we are going to be putting regional priorities into the plan, not just statewide priorities. FWC is currently going through a process of developing regional assessments for each of our 5 regions, which is designed to move multiple high-level planning documents, such as our State Wildlife Action Plan and the Imperiled Species Management Plan that Alex mentioned earlier, and kind of get the regional priorities down from those plans so that people at the regional level will know what the highest priority actions and conservation areas are, rather than just trying to read through plans you probably don't even know exist. And that will help with identifying focal areas and actions at the regional level. And review with partners will be invaluable, since we'll rely on partners in the regional level to tell us, where the focal areas are and important species. And again, there's Allie Perryman's information for the action plan revision. And as I mentioned briefly, we don't have a dedicated funding efforts for state wildlife grants, even though it is the only, the primary federal program that addresses conservation of non-game species and non-listed species. It's annually apportioned by Congress. Every year they vote, and it seems every year they vote with the first vote being funding it with $0, but eventually we get, they come to their senses and give us the annual apportionment. But a blue ribbon panel has been created, and that's a bipartisan effort to pass this act called Recovering America's Wildlife Act through Congress. And if that act passes, then the annual funding for Florida would increase from approximately $2 million a year to about $20 million a year annually. And I believe the statewide request, or the nationwide request, is $1.3 billion. And that funding is not like a new tax or anything. They're recommending just redirecting a portion of funds from energy and mineral revenues that the federal government already receives. And one way that local governments and partners and businesses can help support that is by signing up with Florida's Teaming with Wildlife Coalition. It's basically a list that each state has where people go and sign up. It's kind of like a petition. You sign up and it shows that you're showing support for the funding for state wildlife grants, as well as other fish and wildlife conservation and outdoor recreation. And so there's our website where you can find more information about the State Wildlife Action Plan, the grants program, and also the Teaming with Wildlife Coalition, where you can go and sign up your business or agency. That's all I had. Do you have any questions? Great. Thanks.
All right, so now Tim Towles is going to talk to us a little bit about the Landowner Assistance Program at FWC.
Okay, my name is Tim Towles, and I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about wildlife conservation planning. I'm with the Landowner Assistance Program part of the agency, so it's within the same division as Heather, but with a different office. First of all, just want to illustrate this map of Florida, which shows you where all the public conservation lands are located. You can see that all the green are state lands, so that includes things like state parks, FWC wildlife management areas, water management district lands, national forest preserves, and then there's also federal lands, which are illustrated in gray. So you see we have quite a few federal lands throughout the state, Everglades National Park in the south. You see Merritt Island with the Space Center property there, owned by Fish and Wildlife Service. And the yellow are local lands owned by counties and other municipalities. So there's a good deal of public conservation land throughout the state. Within all the light-colored, whitish area in between is private land. So there's also a lot of good conservation lands in private ownership too. Okay, so in conservation planning services, the people that we work with are pretty much everyone. We work with private citizens, local governments. We assist all these entities, including private landowners, with land use planning, and we provide technical assistance for whatever they need as far, if it's wildlife related, we provide that sort of technical assistance to all these entities throughout the state. We also work closely with our partnering natural resource agencies, such as state parks, U.S. Fish and Wildlife and state parks, Florida Forest Service, and also with the water management districts. And we work closely with federal agencies such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which Alex mentioned, the Partners Program. That's one way we work with them, and also with USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Services. We work closely with them specifically with their Wetlands Reserve Program. Okay, just a little more specifically, within our Office of Conservation Planning, we have a couple of different programs. One of those is the Land Use Planning Program. Staff with this program assist local and county governments and others with landscape level land use planning. This includes such things as DRI reviews, that's developments of regional impact, and site design considerations for avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating fish and wildlife impacts associated with changes in land use. This includes promoting compatible land uses and conservation opportunities. One thing we try to do is strive to maintain important habitat connections between private conservation lands and public conservation lands. And some mitigation options for land use changes include such things as habitat conservation, restoration and enhancement, preservation of rural and underdeveloped lands, and then maintenance of working lands such as large agricultural landscapes or forested lands that have a lot of good natural habitat remaining. And then another side of our Office of Conservation Planning Services is the Landowner Assistance Program. And as the name implies, this is a program that's geared towards working with private landowners. And the focus of the Landowner Assistance Program is to provide wildlife-related technical assistance, such as advice on appropriate land use planning that will benefit wildlife, habitat management practices that they can do to improve habitat for wildlife. And we also hold educational workshops and field days with landowners, invite them to these events. And we also recognize landowners who do a really good job at implementing these habitat management practices for wildlife on their property. A little bit more about our Landowner Assistance Program. It helps private landowners by providing technical assistance to conserve wildlife, as well as improve and restore habitat, all while keeping the land productive for their regular agricultural and recreational uses. And this may include on-site resource assessments. There's baseline evaluations of existing natural resources and current land uses that include detailed ecological habitat mapping that we do for these landowners. We deliver comprehensive and customized habitat-based management plans, and these include identifying potential habitat for focal species and determining where different species occur on the property, identifying rare plants, invasive plant species that can be a problem with conservation of their property, wildlife observations, soils reports. We also help define the long-term goals and objectives for these properties based on information we get from the private landowner and what they want to see. We recommend habitat management activities needed to achieve the landowner's objectives, and we offer recommendations as to how and when to implement these various habitat management practices. And if the landowner applies for another program in the future, such as a cost share program where they can get some financial assistance from an entity that does that, I'll talk a little bit more about that. And if they have a habitat management plan in place, this can help them give a little extra weight in their application process for one of these other cost share programs. Another program that's available, and Alex touched on this, is through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, through the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. And this program is primarily geared towards private landowners, but it can include other partners as well. So they can actually work with counties or other municipalities, other entities, in helping to conserve wildlife habitat. And this is a cost share program whereby they will supply 50% of a set cost to help improve a particular property. And that the intent is to restore native vegetation, hydrology, and soils associated with imperiled ecosystems, or that provide important habitat for rare, declining, or protected species such as the Gopher Tortoise, Florida scrub jays, or any other federally listed species or state listed species, includes both. So this is another program that's available. Also, there's some federal programs that are available through USDA, through the Farm Bill. One of these is called EQIP. That stands for Environmental Quality Incentives Program. It's administered by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. This program provides financial and technical assistance to agricultural producers to address natural resource concerns and deliver environmental benefits. Many of the conservation practices available for cost share under EQIP are specifically geared towards resource and habitat management and include such practices as prescribed burning, brush management, which can mean chemically treating problematic woody species like Brazilian pepper, and also herbaceous weed control, which is problematic plant species like Kogan grass or torpedo grass. So they help through these conservation practices in providing better habitat for wildlife. And if you want to learn more about this program, you can contact this website. You just do Google EQIP US NRCS Florida, and you should be able to get there. Or you can contact the local representative. Is in the lower right-hand part of the screen, which is the district conservationist located in Fort Pierce. The deadline for this program is October 21st this year. So this is, geared towards private landowners. So if you know any private landowners, this would be a good program for them. Also, a part of EQIP is this program, which is the Working Lands for Wildlife program. This is a program that's geared towards listed species that could become listed federally but are not yet in that category, what Alex was alluding to earlier. And the species that was chosen for Florida was the Gopher Tortoise. So this program was developed in concert with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NRCS to help the Gopher Tortoise throughout the state. And for this program also, you would need to contact NRCS, their office in Fort Pierce, or you can go to this website to find more information out about this program. But this is another program that's geared specifically for helping the Gopher Tortoise. And it would include all types of habitat management practices that are beneficial for tortoises, like prescribed burning, exotic plant control, thinning, over-dense pine stands, and that sort of thing. And this is also as a cost share program. I believe it's a 75% cost share for established practices for the program. Another program that we work with in the Landowner Assistance Program is we work closely with the Florida Forest Service on their Forest Stewardship Program. This program is available to private landowners who want to increase the economic value of their forest land while maintaining the environmental integrity of their land. If you want to inquire about this program, you need to contact the local county forester. This is a voluntary program for private, non-industrial forest owners who own at least 20 acres of land, and they're not trying to make a big profit on it from forest products. They're more wanting to do overall natural resource management and have a forest that's beneficial for pretty much everything. And this is not a cost share program, but technical assistance available. A meeting with the landowner would be held on the property with a team of resource professionals, someone from FWC, Florida Forest Service, NRCS. A customized habitat management plan would be produced based on the landowner's objectives, and it would reflect a multi-land use strategy that considers timber, soil, aesthetics, wildlife, water, and recreation. It will be a plan that includes forest stand characteristics, property maps, management recommendations, and would have a 5-year timetable for implementing these various habitat management practices. It can also help on the reduce tax liability if one has a plan in place on their property. The contact information is in the lower right on this slide for Indian River, St. Lucie counties. It's in the Florida Forest Service's Okeechobee district, and there's contact information here. Kaylin Ionita is a contact person. And I just wanted to mention another source of information that can be very useful, especially for folks that work with the county government, is FWC has developed this wildlife conservation guide in concert with the Fish and Wildlife Service. This was done a few years ago, but there's a ton of information available on this site if you want to check it out. It's intended to facilitate effective land use planning, project design, and habitat management with easy to find information concerning everything to do with wildlife conservation. There's links to habitats and natural communities, species information, survey protocols, recovery and management information on permitting, mapping, GIS resources. I don't know how up to date it is on some of the Gopher Tortoise permitting that Alex mentioned, but it's continually being updated. So hopefully it'll be there in the future if it's not there now. But then there's a ton of information there. FWC also works cooperatively with other agencies to provide technical assistance and outreach through the Florida Land Steward Partnership. And one thing that this partnership does is they put out a calendar every year called the Florida Land Steward, which has a lot of information about habitat management tips that private landowners can use to help better manage their lands for wildlife. There's also a free weekly and quarterly newsletter with current and useful information on land management from a multiple use perspective. So this website's a go-to source of assistance and information for managing land and natural resources for long-term environmental, economic, and social benefits. So this Florida Land Steward, there's a link at the bottom of the page if you want to look at the Florida Land Steward, or you can do a Google search and go to this website and find out there's a lot of information there to help you improve management over your conservation lands. So that's pretty much all I've got today. Does anyone have any questions?
All right, thank you very much, Tim. Okay, so we're running a little bit behind, but that's all right. We'll open up the floor to any questions on any of the presentations that have taken place. And what I'll do is I will repeat your question for those that are tuned in via the broadcast. So if anybody has any questions for me or our Gopher Tortoise conservation biologist, Rachel King, please let me know, or Heather or Tim as well. Basically anything we've covered. And if we don't have any questions, we can go out in the field and go look at some burrows. Yes?
Who is a contact? You said there's some ag practices for Gopher Tortoises. Is there a specific contact person for that?
You mean for the best management practices?
Yeah, because I work for the district and do a lot of ag lands and that, and I just wonder if I run into Gopher Tortoises all the time. I don't know if they know that there's like best management practices for them or not. I just wonder who to put them in touch with.
So the question was there any agriculture contacts for the best management practices relating to exempt activities for Gopher tortoises? And the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services would have that information. If you were to, I guess this is the easiest way I know how to do it, if you were to Google Department of Agriculture DAC's best management practices, wildlife best management practices, you'll find contact information for the regional contacts for that.
I also want to mention we have developed some agricultural wildlife best management practices that a landowner, if they're interested, they can sign up for this and they can be exempt from regulatory implications on set of listed species. So I have some of these. If you want, there's a couple back there, but I can give you some of these.
Yes.
If you want to hand them out to landowners that may be interested. Gopher Tortoise is part of it. So.
I apologize for that. Yes, so the Landowner Assistance Program also has information on that for those who are tuning in. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
If one finds a compromised Gopher tortoise, either dead or injured, what's the best thing to do? I've called animal control, but I don't know if they report them. How does that work there?
So the question is, if someone finds a dead or compromised Gopher tortoise, what is the best thing to do? The first step would be to contact the, well, it depends what you think has happened. If you think it's malicious, if you think someone intentionally injured the Gopher tortoise, you would call the Wildlife Alert Hotline, and that would dispatch an officer to come investigate. If it's something like a tortoise was hit by a car or ran over by a mower or something of that nature, you'd want to call our program, and what we have is a list of wildlife rehabbers that are licensed through FWC to rehabilitate wildlife throughout the state of Florida. And then our list specifically has those rehabbers that work directly with Gopher tortoises separated by region. So we would be able to let you know where the closest wildlife rehabber was to you, and then you could call them and they would either come pick up the tortoise or you could bring it to them and they would rehabilitate the tortoise if they could do so.
If it's a dead tortoise and it's no malicious activity or anything, we have our mortality database.
Yes.
If you just look up Gopher Tortoise mortality database, it'll take you right to it and you can provide us that information.
All right, what if the animal seems to still be alive but is really critically injured?
Usually it's best to either take it to a rehabber or to a veterinarian even.
Yes.
I would say veterinarian if it's really bad because they can humanely euthanize it.
So not all wildlife rehabilitators are veterinarians. They're not licensed vets. They're just licensed to rehabilitate wildlife. So although they do have experience in how to rehabilitate specific species, a veterinarian can do some things that they can't do. But depending on the severity of the injuries to the tortoise, really. But a good first step is always to call our program because we can direct you based on the situation.
And if it's after hours?
If it's after hours, best thing to do is probably to call the Wildlife Alert Hotline. I think that's managed
That's 24 hours.
24 hours, yeah. So, or you could search online for a local veterinarian and they can at least stabilize the tortoise in the meanwhile. There are a lot of clinics that are 24 hours or have 24-hour care. And there's usually one somewhat near you, so that's usually the best plan if you can't get a hold of anyone from FWC. No, probably not. Yes, in the back.
A lot of our veterinarians will not take Gopher tortoises, just so you know. I've had it happen on multiple occasions. However, the Humane Society of Vero Beach will take the tortoise and transport it to a rehabber. So usually I just call you guys first, let you know what we're doing. But it is kind of problematic after hours or on a weekend when we can't get in touch with someone. But I have had that experience before where the vets will not touch them. Because they're protected, they don't have anything to do with them.
I've had that experience with a lot of vets who just work with mammals And so it took me a while, but once you find one, it's always good to just keep their information on
Do
hand.
you know of any here?
Well, our doctor was a Dr. Slade that had done some Gopher tortoise in the past. I don't know if he still does, but I think he's, like, repaired shells if they had their shells and, cracked.
I don't think he takes them anymore, but
He'll only take wildlife birds now.
Oh, is that the case? Okay. So he's
It might be
changed
just
his
calling around different veterinarians. I live in Martin County, so I found some in my area.
I'm going to pass this to whoever's answering. All right, so basically certain veterinarians won't take gopher tortoises due to the fact that they're a listed species, so that's one of the reasons you can call us and we can always direct you to who we know take the listed species. Calling the FWC is always a good first step. If it's after hours, it's always going to be more difficult, or if it's on a weekend, but there's always process of elimination. Unfortunately, that's not the best in a scenario where a gopher tortoise is, has been injured and there's a possibility that it might die, but sometimes that's the only thing that you can do. So, but thank you for that information. Yes?
Yeah, the Gopher Tortoise management plan talks about flagging burrows where you can have heavy equipment. At what time of year would be the best time to go around and check burrows and flag them?
You can check for burrows at any time of the year.
They dig them any time of year.
Yeah, they dig them year-round, especially in areas like this. Even in North Florida and in the northern extent of their range, gopher tortoises will dig burrows year-round. Flagging burrows for the purposes you mentioned, which is for heavy equipment, really that's only going to matter if either habitat management is taking place using heavy equipment or it's on a specific site that's slatted for development. So, but flagging burrows in general, you probably don't want to go out into a natural area and just start flagging burrows because that usually draws the wrong element to those burrows. So you have to consider that as well.
What's interesting is we found in a lot of cattle pastures that if you flag a burrow, the cows will come over and eat the flagging tape and then just step in the burrows too and partially collapse them. They love flagging tape for some reason to eat. It's very strange.
Okay, what's the best thing to do? I've got 2 burrows in the front lawn. How close should I cut the grass up to?
So the question is, if you have burrows in your yard, how close should you get when cutting your lawn or mowing your lawn? It's always good to give the burrow a little bit of space. The most important thing is it depends what kind of mower you're using.
You can't do 25 feet.
You don't have to, first of all, mowing your lawn is exempt from our permitting program, so you don't have to avoid the burrow by 25 feet. You can mow right up to the burrow. The most important thing really is to look out for the gopher tortoise itself or any hatchlings or eggs, because even if you accidentally did collapse that burrow while conducting that activity, as I said, it's exempt, the tortoise would likely dig out if it was inside the burrow, but if you were to run over the gopher tortoise with your mower, it would definitely be injured and possibly die. The most important thing to consider when mowing your lawn around a burrow is you should avoid a little bit of the area around it. Always watch out for eggs, especially between April and October, which is nesting and mating season. If you mow at times of the day where gopher tortoises are less likely to be out, that's in our best management practices. So in the summertime, tortoises are going to be out at the cooler times of the day because they're cold-blooded and they're not going to want to overheat. They're going to spend the hottest times of the day in their burrow. So if you mow at, unfortunately, the worst time for you to mow, which is between noon, 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock probably, that's the time that you're less likely to impact a gopher tortoise.
But even if you do it at a certain time of the day, usually they know you're coming,
Yeah.
and they'll get back in their burrows. And
Yeah,
you're out.
and they're pretty quick. They'll usually move into their burrows pretty quickly. But one thing you do want to consider about the burrow itself is mowing over the back of the burrow. That's a good way to collapse it, so you should give some space behind the burrow as well as in front of it. But you don't have to avoid it by 25 feet. And of course, in the wintertime when it's colder out, you want to mow at the warmest times of the day. Did I mess that up? At the coolest times of the day, because that's when gopher tortoises are not going to be around.
Are they nocturnal at all?
That's a good question. So the question is, are gopher tortoises nocturnal at all? Gopher tortoises, if you read in any research, it will say no, they are not. They're completely diurnal. They'll be out during the day only. Sometimes gopher tortoises will be out at night. What is the term you like to use, Rachel, for those tortoises?
I call them, what, like night owls? or
Yeah,
something?
the night owl tortoises, but you say they have like night stops or something
Oh,
like
yeah,
that.
I just think, yeah, they were going for their midnight snack or something.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you'll see tortoises out at night too, foraging.
Very rarely.
It's very rare, and some of the times, if you see a tortoise out at night foraging or basking or doing something like that, it's because they have URTD and it's changing how their natural behavior, how they would normally behave. So URTD, the upper respiratory tract disease that they get, will alter their behavior. Sometimes they'll bask at night. They'll try to regulate their body temperature by basking, but they're doing it in the middle of the night when there's no sun, so it's actually cooling them rather than warming them. The gopher tortoise burrow stays about the same relative temperature and humidity year-round, so that's why they stay in their burrows at night, and for the majority of the day even. There's like about a 10 to 15 degree fluctuation in temperature between summer and winter time in the burrow, and the humidity is about the same year-round. So,
Yeah. But that's, like I said, very, very rare cases. For the most part, these tortoises like to be out in the daytime.
yes. And you had a question,
So
ma'am?
if we see a tortoise that we think is diseased, we call you.
If you see a tortoise that you think is diseased, yes, you can definitely call us. Really, it depends on the situation. So we would handle at a recipient site or something of that nature, or a natural area, a public park. If there was a large-scale die-off due to the disease, that's when we would take action to prevent it from spreading. That's part of the large-scale mortality contingency plan that we have. But for an individual tortoise, like if you had one in your yard that was acting strange, you could take it to a rehabber and they could try to treat it for its conditions, but there is no cure for URTD, so there's not much they would be able to do, unfortunately, especially if it's not likely to be exposed to other tortoises because the disease is spread through contact. The best thing to do would be to leave it be.
That and, well, gopher tortoises, this URTD is not always, mortal. Oftentimes it's a chronic condition.
Yes.
And so it's not going to usually kill the tortoise. There are only some times where it'll cause actual die-offs.
Yeah, it causes morbidity more than mortality, so they don't die from the actual disease itself. It just makes them more likely to die from other conditions. It's kind of like the flu for gopher tortoises, so you don't necessarily...
No treatment at all.
They can be
It's treatment,
treated...
but no cure.
Yeah. So they can be treated with antibiotics. The disease is caused by two different bacteria, the Mycoplasma agassiziae and Testudinium. So it's caused by two bacteria for the most part, and so they can be treated with antibiotics, but it usually doesn't rid them of the condition. It just assists them in living longer, healthier lives. But then you have to be, either willing to pay for that treatment or take them to a rehabber who's willing to continually pay for that treatment. So there is no cure for the disease itself, but you can, a gopher tortoise that's been over basking or basking at weird times of the day or not foraging can be treated by being rehydrated or soaked in a bath or something like that to help it get back to normal. But as far as curing the disease itself, that's not going to happen. So you could take it to a rehabber. But always, if you ever take a tortoise to a rehabber or a vet or anything, always make sure you let them know where it came from. And if it's on your property, be willing to take it back there. And if not, then tell the rehabber where it came from so they can release it back to where it came from. Otherwise, it becomes a waif, and that's a problem.
Is in serious need of wildlife rehabbers.
Yes, well, we license them, but we don't, and that's through our law enforcement program, which is a different division than we're in. But we don't have any say in people applying for them. It's up to them if they want to be a rehabber or not. So, unfortunately, we can't do anything about
There are people, and I'm one of them, there are people listed on the rehabbers list who are only doing transport.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not even a realistic list.
I think we also have a fact sheet on our website for gopher tortoise rehabbers and how they can become registered.
Yes, we have that as well. Yes, ma'am.
I heard just about how to distinguish if they are ill. Is it, can you look at if they don't have a discharge, can they still be ill? Because someone told me you have to, that doesn't really matter, you can be sick and you need a blood test.
Yes, typically, I mean, tortoises can be symptomatic or asymptomatic, and they could be not have any of the symptoms and still carry it at the time. Like I said, it kind of comes and goes oftentimes, the actual symptoms. So, but you can see signs of it usually if you get closer to the tortoise without picking them up or anything. Sometimes you can see if their noses have been, kind of worn a little bit, they're larger than usual. That's a sign of a chronic disease with it. But for the most part, you would need to take blood and have that shipped up to get tested.
Yeah, and also with URTD, so as Rachel said, they can be asymptomatic and still carry it. They can be symptomatic and not necessarily have URTD. Also, if you test them for URTD, the test might come back negative when they carry the disease, and the test may come back positive when they don't have the disease. So it's very difficult to 100%. Yeah, I mean, the signs are, if they're symptomatic, the signs are pretty obvious. So if they have a strong nasal discharge or ocular discharge and reddening of the eyes, and they're acting funny, I'd say there's a pretty good chance they have it. But just because, you think a tortoise might have the disease doesn't mean it necessarily does. Also, some populations of gopher tortoises where URTD is prominent in the population, they just live with it and they have no issues. So they all have these symptoms and they have this disease, but it doesn't cause mortality, and an entire population will live with the disease without any outbreaks that cause large-scale mortalities. Other populations, that's why the waif tortoise issue is so important, is because it's usually when you introduce a tortoise that has URTD to a population that's never experienced it before, it's the same thing as the original, settlers, the colonists coming over to the U.S., from England, bringing disease with them that the Native Americans had never seen. That caused large-scale die-offs because they didn't have any immune response to it. It's the same thing with moving a tortoise that has URTD that comes into contact with a population that's never seen it before. They will likely have a die-off in that circumstance.
I suppose there's no real way for you to know, any statistically, how many are sick in the state?
That would require a lot of testing,
Yes.
And I don't think anybody's willing to do that.
There's
unfortunately.
definitely been papers showing, studies in certain populations throughout their entire range, but there's never been, I think, an entire range-wide systematic study that's a lot of tortoises right there.
Yeah, just in general, the tortoise, the tortoise population of Florida is always an estimation based on what we found in certain areas. It's extrapolated upon. And it's usually based on available habitat, priority, and potential habitat. So we don't even necessarily know the exact tortoise population in Florida, let alone how many in the population have URTD. So it'd be hard to assess. You're welcome. Are there any other questions? No? All right, well, thank you all very much for your time today. Thank you for participating. I know my presentation in particular is very long and filled with information. If anybody wants any information from that or a copy of the presentation, you can email me and I will provide that to you. And anybody who's interested in going out to the natural area around here to look at gopher tortoise burrows, when I discussed the classification of gopher tortoise burrows in the wild, we'll be able to show you how that looks in actuality rather than on a PowerPoint presentation. So thank you all very much. Oh, also, before we leave, there is an evaluation sheet on the back table if anybody would like to fill one of those out for me to let me know how I did, whether I did great or horrible. Either way, I'd like to know. I do these workshops every year, so that would help me adjust the workshops accordingly. So, and
When you going out?
yes, right on that table over there.
When you're going out?
Oh, should be going right now. Yeah. And then also, if you haven't signed in, there is a sign-in sheet. So thank you very much.
County's getting about $2.6 million grant to double lane 66th Ave.